She pointed at him like he was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Get him off my jet." Vivian Mercer didn't raise her voice. She never had to. She stood at the front of the cabin in a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, one finger extended toward the man in the worn jacket sitting quietly in row 3, and every flight attendant in that cabin froze. The man hadn't said a word out of turn, hadn't touched anything he shouldn't have. He was just sitting there with a beat-up canvas bag on his lap and a look on his face like he already knew how this was going to go. "Ma'am, Captain Cole authorized." "I don't care what Adrian authorized. This is my aircraft, and I want him removed." If you've ever been judged before you opened your mouth, if you've ever been the person in the room that someone decided wasn't worth a second look, then stay right here, because this story is going to mean something to you. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next, and hit that like button right now. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happened on that jet? Nobody saw it coming. Not even her. It started the way most disasters do, quietly, and with someone being absolutely certain they were right. Private executive terminal at Mercer Aerotech's Chicago facility wasn't the kind of place you wandered into by accident. There were 2 checkpoints before the tarmac, a biometric gate, and a security team that wore plain clothes but carried themselves like former military, which most of them were. The terminal itself was glass and steel and deliberate silence, the kind of place designed to make you feel the weight of money without anyone saying a word about it. Ethan Vale had been standing near the outer fence for about 20 minutes before anyone noticed him. He wasn't trying to hide. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, a canvas bag hanging off one shoulder, and he was watching the MA-7 Mercer Aerotech's flagship executive aircraft the way a doctor watches a patient who's breathing a little too shallow. Something about the fuel intake port on the starboard side was bothering him. Cap seating looked fractionally off from where he stood. Could be nothing. Probably was nothing. But Ethan Vale had spent 11 years designing the internal safety architecture of aircraft exactly like this one, and probably nothing had never been a phrase he was comfortable letting go of. He was supposed to be on a commercial flight to San Francisco. His daughter, 8 years old, currently staying with his neighbor Mrs. Calloway, had called him at 6 in the morning to say she'd made him a card for when he got home from wherever he was going. His sister Lena had called 20 minutes later from the recovery ward at St. Mary's in San Francisco, her voice still rough from the anesthesia, saying she was fine. She was okay. She didn't need him to come, which meant she absolutely needed him to come. The commercial flight had been canceled. Mechanical delay, no rescheduled departure, and the next available seat wasn't until the following morning. Ethan had spent 40 minutes on hold with 3 different airlines before a former colleague, Derek Payne, had texted him out of nowhere. "Mercer's MA-7 is heading to SFO this afternoon. Private charter. I've got a connection. You want on?" Derek hadn't been entirely honest about what connection meant. What it meant was that Derek knew a guy who knew the ground crew supervisor, and that the supervisor owed Derek a favor, and that technically there was a protocol for approved engineering personnel to ride along on Mercer aircraft when seats were available, and operational necessity could be reasonably argued. It was a thin justification. Ethan knew that. But his sister had surgery 2 days ago and was alone in a hospital ward and was pretending she was fine, so he'd said yes. He'd cleared the first checkpoint with his old Mercer Aerotech badge expired, but the biometric reader still had his fingerprints in the system because nobody had gotten around to deleting them, which probably said something about how the company handled its offboarding process. The second checkpoint he'd gotten through because the security guard had recognized him from 3 years ago when Ethan used to walk this tarmac every day. The man had looked at him for a long moment, looked at the badge, and then just waved him through without a word. So there he was, standing 40 feet from a $60 million aircraft with an expired badge and a canvas bag, watching the fuel intake port that was bothering him. Captain Adrian Cole found him there. Cole was a 15-year veteran of executive aviation, the kind of pilot who had logged more hours than most people would ever know about, and who took aircraft systems seriously in a way that a lot of corporate pilots didn't bother to anymore. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair, and the unhurried manner of someone who'd been in enough tense situations to know that panic solved exactly nothing. He walked up beside Ethan and looked at what Ethan was looking at. "You see something?" Ethan didn't look at him. Starboard fuel intake cap. The seating looks off. Could be the light, but I don't think it's the light. Cole squinted. How off? A few millimeters, maybe less. But at altitude with pressure variance, if there's any kind of imperfect seal on the secondary housing, you get vapor migration into the intake cavity. Ethan paused. Has she been through the full pre-flight sequence yet? We're about 40 minutes out from that. I'd pull the diagnostic on the fuel pressure equalization before you run it. If I'm right about the cap, the reading is going to look fine right up until it doesn't. Cole looked at him for a long moment. Who are you? Ethan finally looked back. Ethan Vale. I used to be head of safety architecture here. Cole knew the name. Ethan could tell from the slight change in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like something clicking into place. You designed the Guardian system. Most of it. Cole looked at the aircraft again. Come with me. They spent the next 18 minutes going through the fuel system diagnostic together, with Ethan talking Cole through the specific subsystem pathways, and Cole running the readings on the maintenance terminal, while 2 ground crew members stood nearby looking uncertain about whether they should be allowing this. The fuel pressure equalization tests came back with 0.3% variance on the starboard secondary housing, small enough that the standard pre-flight checklist would have flagged it as within tolerance, but not small enough that Ethan was willing to call it acceptable. That variance compounds under load, Ethan said. On a 2-hour flight at cruising altitude, you're looking at potential vapor accumulation in the intake cavity. It won't cause a failure, but it'll degrade engine efficiency by somewhere between 4 and 8%, and if there's any weather-related pressure fluctuation, you might get some uneven thrust response that's going to feel unpleasant at best. At worst, Ethan was quiet for a second. At worst, you get an asymmetric thrust event at a bad moment. Cole had the ground crew pull the intake cap and reseat it properly. The whole process took 11 minutes. When they were done, Cole ran the equalization test again, and the variance was gone. Cole looked at Ethan. You want to come to San Francisco? I was trying to get there anyway. Then you're on the manifest. I'll handle it. Cole handled it. What Cole didn't fully account for was Vivian Mercer. Vivian Mercer was 44 years old, had run Mercer Aerotech for 6 years following her father's retirement, and was one of those executives who operated on the assumption that the standards she held for herself, which were genuinely high, gave her the right to hold everyone else to standards she decided on in the moment. She wasn't entirely wrong about her own competence. Taken a company that was coasting on its legacy and pushed it back into genuine relevance. She worked harder than most of the people around her, and she knew it. She also had a particular blind spot, the kind that tends to develop in people who've been deferred to for long enough that they stop questioning their own first impressions. She boarded the MA 740 minutes before departure with her chief attorney Nora Blake and corporate strategist Marcus Hale, who was currently her most trusted advisor and who had, for the past year and a half, been quietly convincing her that the company's future lay in streamlining its safety architecture, reducing what he called redundancy overhead in systems that were costing more to maintain than the risk reduction they provided actually justified. Marcus Hale was 51, well-dressed, and extremely good at talking about safety in ways that sounded responsible while meaning the opposite. He'd spent 20 years in corporate strategy and had the kind of smooth confidence that boardrooms tend to reward, regardless of whether it was attached to anything real. He was also the person who had been most instrumental in pushing Ethan Vale out of the company 3 years ago. Ethan was already seated when Vivian boarded. Row 3, window seat, canvas bag on his lap, jacket that had seen a lot of airports and not a lot of dry cleaners. He wasn't paying attention to the front of the cabin when she walked in. He was looking out the window at the tarmac, thinking about Lena, about whether he should call Mrs. Calloway to check on his daughter about the fuel intake cap and whether he'd caught it early enough. He heard the footsteps stop. Who is this? He turned. Vivian Mercer was standing in the aisle 6 feet away, looking at him with an expression that wasn't quite anger yet, more like confusion that was about to become anger. She was looking at his jacket, his shoes, the canvas bag. Ethan Vale, he said. Captain Cole put me on the manifest. I helped with a fuel system issue before. I didn't ask for your resume. She turned to the flight attendant standing near the galley. Whose authorization does he have? Captain Cole. Get me Adrian. She didn't move her eyes from Ethan while she said it. Cole came out of the cockpit looking unhurried and professionally calm. Ms. Mercer, Mr. Vale identified a fuel system issue during pre-flight and I added him to the manifest under operational. This is a private aircraft, Adrian. It's not a favor service. He's a qualified engineer with clearance credentials, fired credentials. That was Marcus, who had settled into a seat toward the front and was now watching with the relaxed attention of someone watching something they'd been expecting. He'd glanced at Ethan, the way you glance at something you've already dismissed. I can see from here the badge is expired. Ethan didn't say anything to that. Vivian looked at Cole. He's not on the approved passenger list. I added him. You don't have the authority to add passengers to my aircraft. Her voice was controlled, but there was iron underneath it. He needs to leave. Cole's jaw tightened. Ms. Mercer, with respect, this man caught a fuel system variance that our pre-flight would have flagged as within tolerance. He might have Adrian. She said it the way you say a name when you want someone to stop talking. I appreciate what you're trying to do. But I don't know this person. I didn't authorize his presence, and I want him removed before we taxi. The flight attendant, a woman named Greta, who had worked Mercer charters for 4 years and had developed a finely tuned sense for which situations required intervention and which required stillness, did not move. Ethan stood up. He did it slowly, without drama, pulling his canvas bag onto his shoulder. He looked at Cole once, a brief look that said it's fine more clearly than words would have. No problem, Ethan said. Not to Vivian, to Cole. He walked up the aisle. Cabin was small enough that he had to pass within a few feet of Vivian, and as he did, she didn't step aside or look away. She watched him the way you watch something leave a room when you want to be sure it's actually leaving. He passed Marcus without looking at him. Marcus watched him go with a very slight smile that was there and gone in half a second, the kind of smile that lives in the gap between what someone is feeling and what they're willing to show. Top of the air stairs, Ethan stopped. He wasn't going to make a speech. He wasn't the kind of person who made speeches, but something had caught his eye through the open cockpit door as he passed a secondary alert in the lower right quadrant of the safety management display, small, amber-colored, kind of thing you could miss if you didn't know what you were looking at. He'd designed that alert. He knew exactly what it meant. He stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4, looking back into the cockpit from the air stairs. Then he walked down the steps onto the tarmac and didn't look back. The MA-7's cabin door closed behind him with a soft hydraulic seal, the kind of sound that $60 million buys you, clean and final and completely indifferent. Ethan walked across the tarmac toward the terminal building, his shoes loud on the concrete in the way that quiet places make everything sound louder. The afternoon sun was low, and the light came at a flat angle that made the glass of the terminal look almost gold. Inside, through the windows, he could see the rows of chairs in the waiting area, a television mounted near the ceiling showing cable news on mute, a woman reading something on her phone. He pushed through the terminal door and sat down in one of the chairs near the window that faced the tarmac. Outside, the MA-7 was being prepared to taxi. The ground crew had pulled the wheel chocks. The air stairs were folding back against the fuselage. The engines were running. He could see the shimmer of heat exhaust off the turbines from where he sat. He took out his phone and called Lena. She answered on the 4th ring, which meant she'd been awake but debating whether she wanted to deal with a conversation. "I'm not dead," she said before he could say anything. "I know, you called me. I'm also fine. You keep saying that. 'Cause I keep being fine." A pause, the sound of something shifting, maybe her adjusting the phone or moving in the bed. "Where are you?" "Chicago. Flight situation got complicated." "Your flight was canceled." Something like that. "Ethan." She said his name with that particular weight that meant she was about to tell him not to worry, which she always did right before he had the most legitimate reason to worry. "I really am okay. You don't need to—" "What?" "I'm coming." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said, and the word came out a little smaller than she probably wanted it to. He sat there after the call, watching the MA-7 through the terminal window. The jet had begun its slow turn toward the taxi route that led to the main runway. It was moving smoothly, everything looked normal, and Ethan sat with his hands on his knees and thought about that amber alert in the safety management display. The Guardian safety architecture, his system, the one he'd spent 4 years building and 2 years refining and 1 day being walked out of the building for, had 17 alert categories. 15 of them were operational and environmental. 1 was maintenance-related. The 17th was something he'd added in the final phase of development. Something he'd never told the full engineering team about, because he'd been worried about what would happen if someone who didn't understand it tried to modify or disable it. He called it the Sentinel layer. It wasn't part of the standard system documentation. It ran underneath the operational architecture, monitoring for specific anomaly patterns that didn't fit any of the standard failure categories patterns that could only occur if someone had deliberately introduced a modification to a protected system component. The amber alert he'd seen through the cockpit door was the Sentinel layer. It had never activated during any of his testing. In 11 years of the system being in operation across Mercer's fleet, he had never once seen that particular alert in a real aircraft. He was looking at it right now, from 100 yards away, through a terminal window, in a jet that was currently rolling toward a runway with Vivian Mercer and Marcus Hale and a flight crew of 2 on board. Ethan Vale was not by nature a person who acted on instinct. He was a systems thinker. He believed in evidence, in sequential logic, in not concluding things before the data supported the conclusion. But he'd also built the Sentinel layer precisely because there were situations where waiting for data meant waiting too long. He stood up, picked up his canvas bag, walked back to the terminal door. The ground crew supervisor, the same man who'd waved him through the checkpoint earlier, was standing near the gate. "I need to get back to that aircraft," Ethan said. The supervisor looked at him. "Miss Mercer had you removed." "I know." Ethan looked out at the MA-7, which was about 200 yards from the runway entry point now. "Something is wrong with that jet." The supervisor followed his gaze. "Wrong how?" "I don't know yet," Ethan said. "That's the problem." The supervisor was quiet for a moment. He was a man named Frank DeLuca, and he'd been working aircraft ground operations for 22 years, and he had a rule, which was that when an engineer who knew what they were talking about said something was wrong, you didn't ask them to explain it in terms you could understand before you took it seriously. "I can radio the tower," Frank said, "but she already cleared for taxi." "Radio the tower," Ethan said. Frank got on his radio. What happened over the next 4 minutes involved a conversation between the tower and Captain Cole, a conversation between Cole and Vivian Mercer, and a very short and one-sided conversation between Vivian Mercer and the concept of turning around an aircraft she had already authorized to taxi because a man she'd just had removed from it said something might be wrong. She said no. The MA-7 continued toward the runway. Ethan stood at the terminal window and watched it go and felt the particular cold clarity that comes over a person when they understand that they have done what they can and it has not been enough. And then the aircraft stopped. Not a slow stop, not a normal taxi halt. A sudden, complete cessation of forward movement, like something had simply decided it wasn't going any further. The engines didn't cut out. He could still see the heat shimmer from the turbines. But the aircraft wasn't moving. Ethan watched it for a moment. Then he sat back down in his chair, put his canvas bag on the floor beside him, and waited. Because he knew what that stop meant. He'd built the system that caused it. He'd spent 4 years making sure it worked exactly like this, that it couldn't be ignored, couldn't be bypassed, couldn't be argued with by someone who thought their authority outranked a safety protocol. He'd built it to be immovable. He just hadn't expected to be the one sitting outside, watching it be immovable at someone else. His phone rang. He looked at it. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He answered, "Mr. Vale." A woman's voice. Controlled, professional, carrying only the faintest edge of something that wasn't quite alarm, but was definitely adjacent to it. "This is Nora Blake. I'm the chief legal counsel for Mercer Aerotech." "I know who you are," Ethan said. A pause. "We appear to be experiencing a situation with the aircraft's safety management system." "I know," Ethan said. Another pause, longer this time. "Miss Mercer would like to know if you'd be willing to return to the aircraft." Ethan looked out the window at the MA-7, sitting motionless on the taxi route, engines running, going nowhere. "Tell Miss Mercer," he said quietly, "that I'll come back. But I have conditions." Nora Blake had been a lawyer for 19 years, and in that time she had negotiated aircraft leasing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She had sat across from federal regulators who wanted to dismantle her clients' certification agreements. And she had once talked a sitting U.S. senator out of a deposition by finding a procedural angle so narrow most people wouldn't have seen it. She was not easily rattled. She was rattled now. She was standing in the aisle of the MA-7 with her phone pressed to her ear, watching Vivian Mercer on one end of the cabin and Marcus Hale on the other, and the aircraft was sitting completely still on the taxi route, with its engines running and every single standard override procedure failing to produce any forward movement whatsoever. And the man who had designed the system causing all of this had just told her he had conditions. Conditions, Nora repeated. She kept her voice flat. That's what I said. Mr. Vale, I want to be straightforward with you. We have a situation here that— I know what you have, Ethan said. I built it. She closed her eyes for half a second. What are your conditions? Marcus Hale stays away from the aircraft's systems. Physically away. He doesn't touch a terminal. He doesn't stand near the cockpit. He doesn't give instructions to anyone with access to the system controls. If I come back and he's within 10 feet of a system interface, I leave again. Nora turned slightly away from the cabin and lowered her voice. That's a significant ask. Marcus is our chief strategist. He has nothing legitimate to do with what I'm going to be doing. That's the condition. You can take it, or you can call Boeing and explain to them why your aircraft is sitting on a taxi route with the engines running and no one on board able to move it. Nora was quiet. How long before you can get here? She finally said. 10 minutes, Ethan said. Less if Frank DeLuca lets me back through the gate without making it complicated. Nora hung up and turned to face the cabin. Vivian was standing near the galley, arms crossed, and her expression was the expression of someone who had been told something they don't believe, but can't yet disprove. Captain Cole had come back from the cockpit twice in the last 8 minutes to explain, with increasing specificity and decreasing patience, that the aircraft's safety management system had engaged a ground hold protocol that he could not override from the cockpit, that the manual override was producing an authentication request for a specific user credential, and that the credential name on the screen was Ethan Vale. Vivian had listened to this the first time with controlled skepticism, the second time with something closer to disbelief. Now she was on the third iteration of being told the same thing, and what was replacing the disbelief was a very particular kind of anger, the kind that comes from realizing you might be wrong about something and finding the wrongness unacceptable. So you're telling me, she said to Cole, who was standing in the cockpit doorway with his arms at his sides and his face doing the careful professional blankness of a man choosing every word, that we can't move this aircraft without him. The system is demanding authentication from the original architect of the safety protocol. It's not a request I can satisfy from the cockpit. The manual override requires biometric and credential input from the account holder. Cole paused. The account holder is Ethan Vale. That's not possible. We decommissioned his access years ago. The operational access, yes. But the Guardian system has a foundational layer that Cole stopped. He genuinely did not know how to finish that sentence in a way that wouldn't sound like he was defending the man she'd just had removed from the aircraft. The system architecture is more complicated than the standard access levels. Marcus, from his seat, said, it's a legacy credential. There should be an administrative override that IT can. I already tried the administrative override, Cole said, and his voice had a particular clipped quality to it that meant he did not appreciate the suggestion that he hadn't tried the obvious thing. It sent a secondary authentication request to the same account. The cabin was quiet for a moment. Nora said, he's willing to come back. Everyone looked at her. He has one condition. She glanced at Marcus, then back at Vivian. Marcus stays away from the system interfaces while Ethan is working. Marcus laughed. It was a short, controlled sound, not warm. That's not a condition, that's theater. He's performing. Maybe, Nora said, but the aircraft isn't moving. Vivian looked out the cabin window. The tarmac stretched toward the runway entrance 200 yards away, and the afternoon light had shifted lower. And there was a ground crew vehicle parked at a respectful distance that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. She thought about San Francisco. She thought about the Northbridge acquisition, which was not a public negotiation, and which had a timeline attached to it that did not have room for a day's delay, much less two. She thought about the fact that she had put a man off her aircraft for wearing a cheap jacket, and she was now being told she couldn't move the aircraft without him. Tell him he can come back, she said. And Marcus? Vivian looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at her with the practiced calm of someone who had decided this wasn't worth fighting in the moment. Fine, Marcus said. I'll sit here and read. The thing about Marcus Hale when he said something like fine was that it never meant fine. Ethan Vale had understood this about Marcus from approximately the third week they'd overlapped at Mercer Aerotech, back when Ethan was still the head of safety architecture, and Marcus was the newly arrived corporate strategist who kept sitting in on engineering meetings he hadn't been invited to. Marcus collected information the way some people collect favors, quietly, patiently, without ever letting on how much he had. Ethan didn't know what Marcus was thinking as he walked back across the tarmac toward the MA7. He was thinking about Lena. He was also thinking about that Amber Alert. Frank DeLuca walked with him to the air stairs and didn't say much, just nodded once when Ethan said thank you, the nod of a man who'd made a judgment call he felt okay about. The air stairs were down, the cabin door open, and Greta, the flight attendant, was standing at the top with the particular expression of someone who was going to be professionally pleasant no matter what happened next. Ethan climbed the stairs. The cabin felt different with him in it this time. Not the physical space that was the same narrow luxury corridor, the same cream leather seats, the same recessed lighting that turned everything slightly warmer than it really was. But the atmosphere had changed. There was a tightness to it now that hadn't been there before. Nora Blake was seated toward the front with a laptop open and the look of someone calculating. Vivian was at her seat, but not sitting all the way back, the posture of someone who was holding herself in a particular position, because the alternative was admitting she didn't know what to do with her hands. Marcus was reading something on his phone with a focus that was just slightly too pointed. Cole met Ethan at the cockpit door. "She's locked down," Cole said quietly. "Full ground hold. The authentication prompt came up about 4 minutes after you were removed. I've never seen this before." "I know," Ethan said. "Walk me through exactly what you tried." They went into the cockpit together, and Cole ran through everything, the standard override sequence, the administrative bypass attempt, the hard reset of the safety management interface, which had simply re-engaged the same prompt 30 seconds later, as if it were pointing out that rebooting the system was not the kind of solution that was going to work here. Ethan stood behind the co-pilot seat and looked at the display. The authentication request was in a plain format, white text on a dark background, the kind of interface that hadn't been updated since he'd written it, because it existed below the level where the interface team ever looked. It said, "Guardian Safety Architecture Sentinel Layer Active. Manual Authority Suspended Authentication Required, Veil E. Primary Architect Anomaly Classification, Level 4. Level 4. Ethan looked at that for a moment. In the 9 categories of the Sentinel Layer classification system, Level 4 meant deliberate system modification. Not degradation, not equipment failure, not environmental interference. Deliberate modification. "Okay," he said. "Can you clear it?" Cole asked. "I can authenticate. That'll restore manual authority to the cockpit." Ethan kept looking at the screen. "But I need to understand what it found before I do that. If I clear the alert without understanding what triggered it, I'm flying blind." "We have a schedule, Captain." Ethan said it quietly. "Something on this aircraft was deliberately modified. I don't know what yet, and until I know what, I'm not clearing the lock." Cole looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the display. Then he moved aside. Ethan sat down in the co-pilot's seat and started working. He'd written the authentication sequence himself, which meant he knew the secondary access paths that weren't in any documentation. He logged into the Sentinel layer using a credential that his name was technically no longer attached to the system, had been built to recognize his biometric signature regardless of what the HR department had done to his personnel file, because he'd built it that way on purpose, because he'd always suspected there would come a time when someone in a position of authority would make a bad decision, and the system would need to survive that decision. He hadn't expected to be standing here 3 years later, proving himself right, but here they were. The Sentinel diagnostic took 11 minutes to pull. During those 11 minutes, Cole stood behind him and didn't speak, which Ethan appreciated. Through the open cockpit door, he could hear the cabin Nora's fingers on her laptop keyboard, Marcus's occasional quietly cleared throat, the sound of Vivian shifting in her seat. The diagnostic results came back, and Ethan read through them twice. Then he sat very still for a moment. "Adrian," he said. "Yeah, I need about an hour." Cole was quiet. "An hour. Maybe less. But I'm not going to promise less." Cole stepped back to the cockpit doorway and looked out at the cabin. Ethan could hear the conversation beginning, Cole explaining the timeline. Vivian's voice rising slightly before she controlled it, but he wasn't tracking the words anymore. He was looking at the diagnostic and thinking about what it meant and who it pointed to, and whether he was reading it the way he thought he was reading it. The diagnostic had found an electronic module, not a system anomaly, not a software irregularity. An actual physical component that hadn't been in the aircraft's original build and hadn't appeared on any maintenance record, Ethan could pull from the standard documentation interface. It had been installed during a maintenance window, a private one, off the standard schedule log, which was itself a significant irregularity, and it was attached to the navigation system's secondary routing protocol. Ethan understood what a navigation module in that particular location was designed to do. He'd written the architecture that surrounded it. He knew exactly what kind of effect something installed there would have on the aircraft's behavior after takeoff. He sat with that knowledge for a moment. Then he closed the diagnostic view and pulled up the authentication prompt. He needed to make a decision. He could authenticate now, restore manual authority, tell Cole what he'd found, and let the airline process sort it out after they landed in San Francisco. That was the simple path. That was the path that got him on the ground near his sister by evening. Or he could not authenticate. Not yet. He could tell Cole what he'd found and let that information sit in the room with Vivian Mercer and Marcus Hale and see what it did. He thought about Marcus sitting in the cabin, reading his phone with that too focused attention. He thought about the private maintenance window that wasn't on any standard log. He thought about the Level 4 classification and what deliberate modification meant in a system he had specifically designed to be unmodifiable without detection. He stood up from the co-pilot's seat and walked back into the cabin. Vivian looked up at him immediately. She had that particular posture of someone who had been waiting and doesn't want to appear like they've been waiting. Well, she said. I found something, Ethan said. Can you clear the lock? I can. But before I do, I need to tell you what I found. He looked around the cabin. Cole had come out of the cockpit behind him. Nora had closed her laptop. Even Marcus had put his phone down, and his expression was the careful blankness that Ethan recognized. There's a module installed in this aircraft that isn't part of the original build, Ethan said. It's attached to the navigation system. It wasn't installed through standard maintenance. There's no record of it in the documentation I can access from the cockpit terminal. The cabin was very quiet. A module, Vivian said. What kind of module? The kind that would affect where this aircraft goes after takeoff. He said it plainly, without drama, because the fact itself was dramatic enough, and adding anything to it would just be noise. I don't know yet who installed it or when exactly. I know it was done during a private maintenance window that isn't on the standard schedule. Nora had very carefully set her pen down on her notepad. Are you saying? Vivian started. I'm saying someone modified a navigation component on this aircraft outside of the documented maintenance process, and my safety system detected it and locked the aircraft down. Ethan looked at her steadily. That's what I'm saying. That's an extraordinary accusation, Marcus said. His voice was even, professionally skeptical, the tone of a man who dealt in facts and found the current presentation lacking in them. Based on what, exactly? A system that you designed and that nobody else has been able to independently verify. Based on a physical component I can show you, Ethan said. There. It's real, I can pull it. Marcus's expression didn't change. You're telling us that you, a man with an expired badge, who was removed from this aircraft by the owner, who then apparently leveraged a backdoor credential to lock a $60 million jet on a taxi route, are now claiming there's been sabotage. And you're the one who found it. Ethan looked at Marcus for a moment. The thing about Marcus was that what he'd just said was not entirely wrong, structurally speaking. The framing was designed to make Ethan sound like the problem, but the individual facts were accurate. Ethan had an expired badge. He had been removed. He had used a credential that wasn't in the standard documentation, and he was the one making the claim. You're right, Ethan said. It does sound convenient, which is why I'm not asking you to take my word for it. He looked at Vivian. Let me pull the module. Let Cole inspect it. If I'm wrong, it costs you an hour. If I'm right, it's the most important hour you've spent. Vivian looked at him. She was thinking he could see it, the slight tension in her jaw, the way her eyes moved to Marcus and then away from Marcus. The calculation of someone who was trying to figure out which risk was bigger. Do it, she said. Marcus stood up from his seat. Vivian, I think we should discuss. Sit down, Marcus. She said it quietly, without looking at him. He's pulling the module. Marcus sat down. That careful blankness was still on his face, but something underneath it had shifted slightly, the way a room shifts when a temperature changes and you're not sure if it's warmer or colder. Ethan went back into the cockpit with Cole. She wants me to pull the module, Ethan said. Cole looked at him. You know where it is? I know where the diagnostic says it is. Starboard aft electronics bay, attached to the navigation routing processor. He paused. I'm going to need access to the bay panel. I'll get the keys. Cole reached for the maintenance panel. Then he stopped and looked at Ethan. If you're right about this. I know, Ethan said. That's not a maintenance error. That's not a vendor part that got installed wrong. That's someone making a deliberate choice. I know, Ethan said again. Cole got the keys. The electronics bay was accessed through a small panel in the aft section of the fuselage, behind the last row of seats. Ethan knelt on the cabin floor and worked the panel release, while Greta, the flight attendant, stood nearby with an expression that was professionally calm and personally extremely concerned. Panel came loose, and Ethan reached in with the penlight Cole had handed him and played the beam over the component racks. He found it in 40 seconds. It was small, about the size of a thick paperback book, matte black casing, seated between the navigation routing processor and the secondary communications interface. It had been installed neatly, professionally, with proper mounting hardware, the kind of work that looked legitimate from every angle, except that it wasn't supposed to be there. Ethan didn't pull it. Not yet. He photographed it with his phone, multiple angles, then photographed the surrounding components so the context was clear. Then he carefully disconnected it, removed it from the bay, and sat back on his heels, holding it in both hands. Vivian had come to the back of the cabin. She was standing 2 seats away, looking at the thing in Ethan's hands with an expression that was working very hard to stay controlled. That's not supposed to be there, she said. No, Ethan said. It's not. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at him. What does it do? It interfaces with the navigation system's secondary routing protocol, he said. After takeoff, under specific conditions, it can direct the aircraft toward a pre-programmed alternative route without triggering the standard course deviation alert. The silence in the cabin had a different quality now. Heavier. Without the pilot knowing? Cole said from behind Vivian. Pilot would know something was off. The autopilot behavior would feel wrong. But the alert that should flag an unauthorized course change wouldn't fire, because the module spoofs the system's position data in a narrow enough band that the deviation looks like a minor drift correction. Ethan turned the module over in his hands. By the time it was obviously wrong, you'd already be significantly off course. Noraplex said very quietly, where would we have ended up? I don't know yet, Ethan said. The destination would be programmed into this. He held up the module. I'd need to interface it with a diagnostic system to read it. He looked around the cabin, at Nora's carefully still face, at Vivian, who was gripping the headrest of the nearest seat with one hand, not tightly, but enough that her knuckles were pale, at Marcus, who was still in his seat at the front of the cabin, and who had not come back to see what was happening, which was either because he was respecting Ethan's condition about staying away from the system interfaces, or because he already knew what Ethan had found and didn't need to look at it. Ethan held that thought. Then he stood up, put the module carefully in his canvas bag, and walked back to the cockpit. He sat down in the co-pilot's seat, pulled up the authentication prompt, and entered his credentials. Screen shifted. The ground hold released with a soft system chime that was almost polite about it, given everything. The cockpit displays normalized. The navigation interface came back to its standard configuration, and at the bottom of the primary screen, in small green text it said, Manual authority restored, Guardian safety architecture active. Cole stood in the cockpit doorway looking at the display for a moment. She's clear to fly, he said. Yes, Ethan said, she is. He didn't move from the co-pilot's seat right away. He sat there looking at the display, at the green text, at the familiar interface of the system he'd built from the ground up in a time when he'd still believed the company he was building it for deserved it. Through the cockpit window, the runway was still there. The afternoon light flatter and colder now, the sky toward the west going a dull orange along the horizon. Somewhere in San Francisco, Lena was in a hospital bed, pretending she was fine. Ethan picked up his canvas bag, stood up and walked back into the cabin. Vivian was watching him from the center aisle, with an expression he couldn't entirely read, not the cold authority she'd walked in with, but not entirely open either. Something in between. Something she hadn't decided on yet. Aircraft's clear, he said. You can proceed to the runway. She nodded once, a small thing, then looked away. Thank you. He didn't respond to that. He went back to row 3, put his bag on his lap, and looked out the window as the MA-7 began to move again. Slow and deliberate, rolling toward the runway entrance in the last of the afternoon light. Marcus hadn't said anything since Ethan pulled the module from the bay. He was still in his seat at the front of the cabin, and when Ethan had walked past him, Marcus had been looking out his own window with that careful blankness fully restored, and he hadn't looked up. Ethan thought about the private maintenance window. He thought about the credential that would have authorized it. He thought about the fact that the module had been installed by someone who knew exactly where to put it, not a general knowledge of aircraft systems, but a specific, detailed knowledge of the Guardian architecture's navigation integration points. The number of people with that specific knowledge was very small. Ethan looked at the back of Marcus Hale's head from row 3 and thought about that number. The aircraft reached the runway threshold and stopped for final clearance. The engines held at idle, the airframe steady beneath him, and for a moment everything was just the sound of the turbines and the distant voice of the tower on the radio, and the particular stillness that exists in the breath before a jet begins its takeoff roll. Then clearance came through, and the engines spooled up, and the MA-7 moved forward, and whatever was coming next was already in motion. The MA-7 climbed through 8,000 feet before anyone in the cabin said anything that mattered. The first 20 minutes after takeoff were the kind of quiet that happens when people are in the same room with an unresolved thing, and everyone is pretending to be occupied with something else. Nora had her laptop open again. Marcus had gone back to his phone. Vivian was looking out the window at the cloud layer below with an expression that was doing a lot of work to appear like thoughtful contemplation rather than what it actually was, which was a woman trying to figure out how badly she'd miscalculated something. Ethan was in row 3 with his canvas bag on the floor between his feet, the module, sitting inside it wrapped in a spare handkerchief Cole had produced from somewhere, and he had his own phone in his hand but wasn't looking at it. He was thinking about the diagnostic readout he'd memorized before clearing the lock. He was turning it over in his mind the way you turn a physical object over, checking each surface. Greta brought him a coffee without being asked. He looked up, surprised. Ethan's idea, she said, and walked away before he could respond. It was bad coffee, the kind that comes from a machine that costs more than it should and produces results that don't justify the cost. But he drank it anyway because he hadn't eaten since 6 in the morning and his hands needed something to do. The module was in his bag, and the module had a story inside it. Question was whether he could read that story with what he had available, or whether he needed equipment he didn't currently have access to at 37,000 feet over the middle of the country. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Caleb Ross. Caleb was 43, lived in Oakland, and had been Ethan's lead integration engineer for the first 2 years of the Guardian system development, before leaving Mercer to start his own avionics consulting firm. He was one of maybe 6 people in the world who understood the Guardian architecture as well as Ethan did, possibly 7 if you counted a graduate student at MIT who'd written a dissertation on it. The student had only worked from documentation, and documentation only told part of the story. The text said, "I need you to be available when I land in SFO. Bringing you something. It's important." Caleb's response came back in under a minute. Define important. Ethan thought about how to define it. Then he typed, "Someone installed a navigation module in an MA-7 that isn't in any maintenance record. Pulled it off the aircraft. 3 minutes of nothing. Then are you serious?" "Yes, I'll be at the airport." Ethan put his phone down and looked at the seat back in front of him and thought about the private maintenance window. The Sentinel layer logged what it found, but didn't always log everything about how it found it. The diagnostic had given him the anomaly classification and the component location and a timestamp range for when the modification had been introduced, sometime in the previous 9 days, based on the system's monitoring cycle. 9 days was a specific window. Mercer's MA-7 had a scheduled maintenance check every 90 days, and the standard check had been completed 18 days ago, which meant the module had been installed in the 7-day gap between the end of the standard maintenance and the current flight. 7 days. A private window. Someone with access to the aircraft outside of the documented service schedule. That level of access didn't belong to line technicians. It didn't belong to ground crew. It didn't belong to people who serviced the aircraft on its regular rotation. The list of people who could authorize an undocumented maintenance access window for a Mercer executive aircraft was short, and it started with the executive team. He was still working through this when Marcus appeared in the aisle beside row 3. Ethan looked up. Marcus was holding a glass of something that was probably sparkling water, and his expression had the easy confidence of a man who decided the conversation he was about to have was one he could win. "Mind if I sit?" He indicated the empty seat beside Ethan, without waiting for an answer, and settled into it, crossing one leg over the other like he was settling in for a collegial chat. You said you'd stay away from the system interfaces, Ethan said. I'm not near a system interface. I'm near you. Marcus glanced at the canvas bag. Is it in there? What do you want, Marcus? I want to understand what you think you've found. He said it reasonably, the tone of someone genuinely curious, which was the tone Marcus used when he was least genuinely curious. Because what I think you've found is an avionics component that you don't have context for, and I think you've built a narrative around it that says something convenient. Convenient for who? For you. He said it without heat. You were pushed out of this company. That's a real thing that happened, and I understand it left you feeling. Marcus. Ethan said it the way you say a word when you want to stop a sentence from completing itself. Don't. Marcus paused. Don't what? Don't do the thing where you reframe what's happening as being about my feelings. Ethan looked at him steadily. There's a physical component in that bag that wasn't authorized. It's real. You can have the whole conversation you want to have about my feelings after someone explains where it came from. Marcus looked at the bag. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they're deciding which direction to go. You don't know who installed it, he said. Not yet. You don't know what it actually does. You have a theory based on its location in the system architecture. I have more than a theory. You have a diagnostic readout from a system you built that found something you say shouldn't be there. He turned his glass slowly in his hand. You understand how that looks. You already made that point on the ground, Ethan said. I heard it the first time. Marcus was quiet again. Then he said, what are you planning to do with it? Have it analyzed. By who? Someone qualified. Marcus looked at him for a moment with those even careful eyes. You know this is going to become a legal matter. I know, Ethan said. Accusations of deliberate modification to a flight-critical system. Federal aviation statutes. Regulatory investigation. He said it like he was listing items on a grocery list. That's a long road. And if you're wrong, it's a road that ends badly for you, not for the company. Ethan looked at him. I'm not wrong. Marcus stood up from the seat in the unhurried way of someone who has accomplished what he came to accomplish, which, as far as Ethan could tell, was to determine whether Ethan was rattled. The answer was no, and Marcus had registered that, and now he was leaving. I hope you're not, Marcus said, which was not what Ethan expected him to say. He walked back to the front of the cabin. Ethan watched him go. The thing about that last line, I hope you're not, was that it could mean several things. It could be a genuine statement from a man who understood that if there really was unauthorized hardware in the aircraft he'd been flying on, that was bad for everyone. It could be the kind of thing you say when you want to appear reasonable. Or it could be the thing you say when you know exactly what the hardware is and what it does, and you've already run the calculation on what happens next. Ethan turned toward the window and watched the clouds for a while. Somewhere over Nevada, Vivian came back. She didn't sit in the seat Marcus had vacated. She stood in the aisle, one hand on the headrest of the row ahead of him, and she had that quality of someone who has made a decision and is now slightly unsure what to do with it. I owe you an apology, she said. He waited. What I did at the gate. How I spoke to you. She looked like the words were costing her something, not because she was insincere, but because apology was genuinely not a motion she performed often, and she was out of practice with the mechanics of it. That was wrong. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the way she'd looked at his jacket. The way she'd said, I don't care what Adrian authorized, with that absolute certainty, the certainty of someone who'd been right about enough things to stop noticing when she might be wrong. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay, I accept it. He wasn't warm about it. He wasn't cold either. Just even. It happened and now you know you were wrong about it. That's about as much as either of us can do with it. She looked at him for a moment, like she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that response. Then she said, what did you find? Really, in terms that aren't technical. He thought about how to say it plainly. Someone used access to this aircraft that they weren't supposed to have, and they installed a device that was designed to change where this aircraft would go after takeoff, without the crew being aware, without you being aware. Why, she said, not dramatically, just a flat, direct question. I don't know yet. That's the honest answer. I have a theory. But I need to interface the module with proper equipment before I can tell you what the destination was. The destination. She said it slowly, like she was working out the implications as she spoke. So we would have landed somewhere that wasn't San Francisco. Probably not landed. Diverted. At some point in the flight, the navigation would have begun a gradual course correction toward a secondary destination. Gradual enough that it might look like weather avoidance or air traffic control routing before it became obvious. And then? And then you'd be somewhere you weren't supposed to be, and whatever was supposed to happen in San Francisco wouldn't happen on schedule. He paused. I don't know what was supposed to happen in San Francisco. The silence that followed had a different texture than the earlier silences in the cabin. Vivian was very still, the kind of still that isn't calm but looks like calm from the outside. The Northbridge acquisition, she said quietly, and it wasn't directed at him. It was the voice of someone thinking out loud, following a thread. Ethan didn't respond to that. It wasn't his thread to follow. There's a deadline, she said. A structural deadline in the acquisition agreement. The lead signatory isn't present for the preliminary board verification by 10 tomorrow morning. The exclusivity window expires, and the deal goes back to open competition. She looked at him. If this aircraft had been diverted, you'd miss the deadline. She looked at him for a long moment. How long has Marcus been with the company? Ethan said, That's not a question I can answer for you. I'm not asking you to answer it. I'm thinking out loud. She straightened up, her hand coming off the headrest. She looked tired in a way that wasn't physical. $700 million, she said almost to herself. And someone thought it was worth this. She went back to the front of the cabin. Ethan sat with what she'd said and felt something settle in his chest that was partly the satisfaction of a theory becoming more solid and partly something considerably more uncomfortable, which was the knowledge that if the Northbridge deal was the motive, then the circle of people who knew about it, who understood its timeline, who had the access to arrange a private maintenance window on the MA7, that circle wasn't large. And Marcus Hale had been in every meeting that mattered. The MA7 landed at San Francisco International 43 minutes later, a smooth arrival that Ethan noticed precisely because it was smooth Cole had flown the approach manually, which was his prerogative, and also, Ethan suspected, quiet decision made by a man who didn't entirely trust any automated system on this aircraft until someone had finished understanding what had been done to it. Caleb Ross was waiting outside the executive terminal. He was a tall man, somewhere between lean and thin, with a kind of perpetually distracted expression that came from spending 20 years thinking about systems architecture. He had a coffee cup in each hand when Ethan came through the door, and he handed one to Ethan without preamble. You look terrible, Caleb said. I've had a day. You said an MA7. Caleb looked at the canvas bag. Is that it? Wrapped in a handkerchief in the front pocket. Don't unwrap it until we're at your workspace. I don't want it handled more than it has to be. Caleb nodded, looking at the bag with the focused attention of an engineer who has been told there's a problem and wants to get to the problem immediately. I've got a full diagnostic rig at the office. If that module has readable data, we'll get it. How long? Depends on the interface architecture. If it's standard avionics protocol, an hour, maybe less. If it's custom, longer. Ethan already knew it was going to be custom. He didn't say that yet. They went to Caleb's car. On the way, Ethan called the hospital and told the nurse on Lena's ward that he was in San Francisco and he'd be there by evening. The nurse said Lena was resting. Ethan said he'd call again before he came over. Your sister? Caleb asked when he hung up. Yeah. She okay? She says she is. Caleb looked at him briefly. But you came anyway. Yeah. Caleb drove them to his office in Redwood City, a nondescript building in an industrial complex that housed 3 other small engineering firms and a packaging company. The kind of place that looked like nothing from the outside and contained a surprising amount of sophisticated equipment once you were through the door. His workspace was organized in the particular way of someone who knew exactly where everything was, even though it would look like chaos to anyone else. He set up the diagnostic interface while Ethan sat in the spare chair and drank the coffee and finally ate half a granola bar that Caleb produced from a drawer, which was not an adequate meal but was better than nothing. Okay, Caleb said, pulling on a pair of nitrile gloves. Let's see what you've got. He unwrapped the module with the careful hands of a man who understood that physical evidence was only useful if it stayed uncompromised. He turned it over, examined the casing, looked at the connector ports. His expression was focused and unreadable in the way that Ethan recognized as genuine concentration rather than performed competence. This is custom work, Caleb said. I know. The casing is stock. I recognize this housing format. It's a third-party avionics shell that you can order through about 15 different suppliers. But the internal configuration, He turned it again, angling it toward his work light. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. This isn't a hobbyist's idea of sabotage. This is professional work. Can you interface it? Give me a few minutes. Caleb spent the next 32 minutes working through the connection process, which involved 3 different adapter configurations before he found the one that the module would talk to. Ethan sat and didn't talk and let him work. This was the part that required patience, and patience was something Ethan had developed over 11 years of designing systems that required you to wait for results rather than assume them. The diagnostic terminal populated slowly, line by line, the data structure emerging the way a photograph used to emerge, in a darkroom indistinct at first, then resolving into something you could read. Caleb leaned forward. "There's a destination programmed," he said. "Where?" Caleb read it. Then he read it again. "A private airfield. I'm pulling the coordinates." He typed, waited. "It's outside of Stockton. Small facility, privately operated. Not a commercial airport." He turned the monitor toward Ethan. "Mean anything to you?" Ethan looked at the coordinates. He didn't recognize them immediately, but that wasn't the point. The point was that someone had programmed a specific alternative destination into a device installed in a $60 million aircraft owned by the CEO of Mercer Aerotech. And that destination was a small private airfield within 2 hours of San Francisco, and the timing of the diversion triggered after takeoff, gradual enough to avoid immediate detection, would have added somewhere between 2 and 4 hours to the journey. 4 hours. If the Northbridge deadline was 10 o'clock the following morning, and the flight left Chicago in the mid-afternoon, even a 2-hour diversion would have put Vivian Mercer significantly behind schedule. "Caleb," Ethan said, "pull up everything you can find on who owns that airfield." Caleb typed. It took less time than Ethan expected. "Registered to a holding company. Meridian Air Logistics, LLC, incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago." He kept reading. "Director of record is Wait." He stopped. "What?" Caleb turned the monitor all the way toward Ethan. "The registered agent for Meridian Air Logistics is a law firm. The same law firm that handled the incorporation of Hale Strategic Consulting Group." Ethan sat very still. He'd known, walking out of that cockpit on the ground in Chicago, that the person behind the module wasn't random. He'd known it was someone inside the company's orbit. He'd suspected Marcus with specific suspicion that comes not from dislike, though he didn't like Marcus, but from the pattern of access and knowledge and motivation that only fit a small number of people. And of those people, Marcus fit it most completely. But suspicion is not evidence. He'd spent his career in engineering understanding the difference. This was evidence, not conclusive on its own. A good attorney would argue the corporate connection was coincidental, would argue that a shared law firm didn't establish knowledge or intent, would argue that Ethan Vale had a documented grievance against the company, and specifically against Marcus Hale, and therefore his interpretation of ambiguous evidence should be treated with appropriate skepticism. But it was a thread, and threads pulled carefully tended to connect to other threads. "I need to make some calls," Ethan said. "Use my office." Caleb gestured toward the inner room. "I'll keep pulling on the corporate records." Ethan went into the office and closed the door and stood there for a moment with his phone in his hand, thinking about sequence. What to do first? Who needed to know what and in what order? He called Lena first, because he'd said he would, and because she answered on the second ring this time, which meant she'd been waiting for it. "You're in San Francisco," she said. "Redwood City, technically. I'll be at the hospital in a few hours." "You don't have to." "Lena." A pause. "Fine. I have terrible hospital food, and I'm watching a reality show about people who renovate houses, and it is genuinely the most compelling thing I've ever seen, and I would like a witness." "I'll bring food," he said. "Good food, reasonable food." She laughed, and the laugh sounded tired underneath it, the real kind of tired that comes from a body that has been through something and is working on recovering. And Ethan stood there in Caleb's borrowed office and felt the tightness in his chest that had been there all day shift into something different. Not gone, but different, the specific quality of relief that comes from hearing the voice of someone you love when you've been afraid, all day without entirely admitting it, that something might be wrong. "I'll be there," he said. "I know," she said. He hung up and stood there another moment. Then he called Cole. Cole picked up on the first ring. He was still at SFO, handling the aircraft's post-flight process, which was going to involve a maintenance hold given the events of the day. "We've started reading the module," Ethan said. "It has a programmed destination. Private airfield outside Stockton. There are corporate connections in the registration I think you need to know about. Cole was quiet for a moment. How solid are the connections? Solid enough that I'm calling you. Not solid enough to go to the FAA without more. What do you need? I need the access log for the MA7's maintenance history. Not the standard documentation. The actual system log, the one the aircraft generates internally. I need to see if there's an entry for an access event that isn't in the official paperwork. Cole understood what he was asking. The aircraft's internal system log was separate from the maintenance documentation that went into official records. It was the kind of log that captured every time someone opened a panel, every time a system was accessed, every door that was opened in the electronics bays. It wasn't usually requested because it wasn't usually relevant. I can pull it, Cole said. But it's going to flag with the maintenance team when I do. Let it flag, Ethan said. At this point, I want it flagged. Cole said he'd have it within the hour. Ethan came back out to the main workspace and found Caleb with 3 browser windows open and an expression that meant he'd found something. The holding company, Caleb said. Meridian Air Logistics. 18 months old, Delaware Incorporation. Same law firm as Hale Strategic. It filed an amendment to its operating agreement 6 weeks ago. He turned the monitor. It added a second director. Ethan looked at the name. He'd known the name for 3 years. He'd seen it attached to decisions that gradually stripped down the Guardian system's redundancy layers. One approval at a time, each one small enough to look like routine budget management, all of them together amounting to something that had fundamentally changed what the system could do. The name on the screen was not Marcus Hale. It was Raymond Voss, Vivian's uncle, the company's senior strategic advisor, who had been with Mercer Aerotech for 19 years, who had overseen the transition when Vivian's father stepped back, and who had been, in Ethan's experience, person who rubber-stamped every one of the modifications to the Guardian system that Marcus had recommended. Ethan had always thought of Raymond as passive, the older executive who deferred to the younger talent, who nodded along because he was past the age of generating his own ideas. He'd been wrong. Raymond hadn't been passive. Raymond had been patient. He thought about the Northbridge acquisition. A $700 million deal that would expand Mercer Aerotech's portfolio significantly into commercial aviation systems. He thought about who would benefit from Mercer not completing that acquisition, who had the competing interest, who stood to gain if the deal fell apart and the company's market position weakened, and someone needed to come in and stabilize things. He thought about the kind of people who could quietly restructure a company when its leadership was discredited or destabilized or simply delayed past a critical deadline. Caleb, he said, I need you to look up Northbridge Flight Systems. Find out who their current largest external shareholders are. Caleb typed, pulled the filing, scrolled. Biggest external position, he said, held by a fund called Vantage Capital Strategies. He typed more. Managing partner Raymond Voss, Ethan said. Caleb looked at him. You already knew. I just figured it out. Caleb sat back in his chair with the expression of someone who has been looking at a technical problem and just realized it's also a human problem, which is always a more uncomfortable thing. So Vivian's uncle is an investor in the company she's trying to acquire. And if the acquisition fails, Northbridge's value goes up relative to Mercer's, Ethan said. And whoever holds the larger position in Northbridge going into an open competition for the acquisition has leverage they didn't have before. This is beyond an avionics consultation, Caleb said. I know. Ethan picked up his phone again. I need to call Vivian Mercer. He found her number through Nora Blake, who answered his call with the wariness of someone who had been expecting to hear from him and wasn't sure they were ready to. I need to speak with Vivian, he said. She's in a meeting. Nora. He said it without pressure, but without softness either. The module had a program destination. There are corporate connections in that destination's ownership that link to someone inside Mercer Aerotech's executive structure. This isn't a disgruntled employee with a grudge. This is something bigger than that, and she needs to know tonight. Nora was quiet. Then give me 10 minutes. Vivian called back in 7. Ethan told her what Caleb had found the airfield. The holding company, the law firm, the corporate amendment, the Northbridge shareholding. He told it plainly, in order, without emphasis, because the facts were emphatic enough without his help. Vivian listened without interrupting, which surprised him. He'd expected her to push back, to question the connections, to do what Marcus had done on the aircraft and point out the gaps in the chain. She didn't do any of that. She listened all the way to the end. When he finished, She was quiet for a long moment. Raymond, she said finally. Not a question. Not outrage. Just his name, in the voice of someone absorbing something that changes what they thought they knew about a significant portion of their life. Corporate connections point there, Ethan said. I want to be careful about saying more than the evidence says. But you think it's Raymond? He thought about how to answer that honestly. I think the structure of what was set up the timeline, the access level required. The financial motive points to someone with deep institutional knowledge of the company and a specific financial interest in the Northbridge deal failing. Raymond fits that description better than anyone else the evidence connects to. Another silence. And Marcus? Marcus may have been the operational piece, Ethan said. He would have had the technical contacts to commission the module. He would have had the access to authorize the maintenance window. But the financial architecture of the motive, that's Raymond. He heard her breathe out, a long and controlled exhale. I need to talk to Nora. You should also call the FAA tonight, Ethan said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. The access log from the aircraft Cole is pulling it. When you have it, that plus the module gives you a physical evidence chain. You want to initiate the federal notification before anyone has the opportunity to clean up anything that might still be cleanable. You sound like you've thought about this, she said. I've been thinking about it since Chicago, he said. She paused. Why? You were off the aircraft. You didn't have to come back. You didn't have to pull the module. You didn't have to call me tonight. She wasn't challenging him. She sounded genuinely uncertain. Ethan thought about how to answer that honestly, too. He thought about the Guardian system, about 4 years of building something that was supposed to keep people safe, about watching it get quietly dismantled decision by decision until it barely resembled what he'd designed. He thought about sitting in that terminal, watching the jet roll toward the runway, and knowing what the Amber Alert meant and not being able to make himself stay in his seat. Because I built the system that stopped that aircraft, he said. And the reason I built it the way I built it was because I was afraid of exactly this kind of thing. Not this specific thing, I didn't design it for this, but the category of it. The idea that someone could make a financial calculation and decide that safety was the variable to adjust. He stopped. I didn't come back for you. I came back because the system I built was telling me something was wrong, and walking away from that would have meant that everything I built it for was worth less than my feelings about being put off the aircraft. Vivian was quiet for a long time, long enough that he wondered if the call had dropped. I'll call you when I've spoken with Nora, she finally said. I'll be at St. Mary's Hospital, he said. My sister. Right, another pause. I hope she's okay. She says she is, Ethan said. I'm beginning to believe her. He hung up, looked at Caleb. Go see your sister, Caleb said. I'll keep documenting everything we've pulled. When Cole's log comes in, forward it to me and I'll cross-reference. Ethan nodded. He picked up his canvas bag. The module was no longer in it. It was on Caleb's workbench in a labeled evidence bag, photographed and logged and attached to a formal chain of custody document that Caleb had started without being asked, because Caleb understood that the difference between evidence and just an interesting piece of hardware was how carefully you handled it from the first moment. At the door, Ethan stopped. Caleb, he said, 3 years ago, when I was walked out of Mercer. Were you surprised? Caleb thought about it, really thought about it, which was his way he didn't give reflexive answers. No, he said finally. I was angry, but I wasn't surprised. He looked at the module on the workbench. The people who do what Marcus does, they don't get rid of the people who are wrong. They get rid of the people who make it harder to be wrong without consequences. Ethan thought about that. Then he went to see his sister. St. Mary's at 9 in the evening had that particular hospital quiet. That wasn't really quiet, monitors beeping somewhere down the hall, a cart rolling past the doorway, the sound of a television through a partially closed door, but felt like quiet compared to everything the day had been. Lena's room was on the 4th floor. She was sitting up when Ethan came in, which she'd clearly arranged specifically so she wouldn't look like she was lying down when he arrived, because Lena had a particular relationship with appearing fine that involved a lot of physical positioning. She was 36, 3 years younger than Ethan, and she had their mother's coloring and their father's stubbornness and a post-surgical pallor that she was doing her best to ignore. You look terrible, she said. Caleb said the same thing. Caleb's right. She looked at the bag he was carrying. Is that food? It's from the place on Valencia that you like. You went all the way to... I had time. He hadn't, really. He'd taken a rideshare from Caleb's office to the restaurant and then directly to the hospital, and the detour had added 40 minutes. But the look on her face when she opened the container made the math work out fine. They sat together while she ate, and he drank bad coffee from the floor's vending machine, and he told her an abbreviated version of the day: the fuel cap, getting removed, the lock, the module, in the same tone you use when you're recounting something that happened to someone else. Slightly distant, slightly ironic. Lena set down her fork halfway through. Someone put a navigation device in the aircraft, she said. Yes, to reroute it. Yes, and you pulled it out. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. And you're telling me this like it's a mildly inconvenient Tuesday. It was a mildly inconvenient Tuesday, mostly. Ethan. She said his name with the particular weight of a younger sibling who has spent her whole life watching an older brother treat genuinely alarming situations as engineering problems to be solved rather than things that should produce a normal human stress response. That's not mildly inconvenient. That's someone tried to hijack a plane. Not hijack exactly. To redirect it without the pilot's knowledge to a location that wasn't on the flight plan. What would you call that? He thought about it. Technically, navigation fraud. Possibly reckless endangerment. The legal classification is Nora Blake's problem, not mine. Lena stared at him. Then she picked up her fork again. You're impossible. You're recovering well, he said. Your color's better. Don't change the subject. I'm not. Both things can be true. She pointed the fork at him. You're going to have to talk to someone official about this. Already in motion. And also in motion. He looked at her. How are you actually feeling? She paused, and the pause was the real answer before she said anything. Sore, she said finally. Tired, the kind of tired that isn't about sleep. She looked at her food. I keep thinking I'll feel like myself again, and then I don't quite get there. That takes time. I know it takes time. I just don't like that it does. She pushed a piece of something around the container. Are you staying tonight? I have a hotel 2 blocks away. You don't have to, Lena. Okay, she said, smaller again, the same way she'd said it on the phone that morning, and he understood that what she meant was not okay, I accept this, but okay, I'm glad. They stayed like that for another hour, talking about small things, his daughter's latest school project, which apparently involved building a model of a suspension bridge out of popsicle sticks and had become a household engineering consultation, a neighbor who'd left Lena a plant to look after and then moved to Portland, a book Lena was reading that she described as terrible in a way that made it clear she couldn't put it down. Normal things. The kind of conversation that exists specifically to be the opposite of everything else. When he left, she was already most of the way asleep, fighting it in the stubborn way she always had, and he turned off the overhead light and pulled the door most of the way closed and stood in the hallway for a moment, just breathing. His phone buzzed. Nora Blake. He walked toward the elevator before answering. Nora, we've retained outside counsel, she said, independent of the company's regular legal team, which Vivian felt was necessary given the scope of what you've shared. We've made the FAA notification. A preliminary report went through 2 hours ago. A pause. Captain Cole's system log came through. There's an Axis event in the MA7's internal records that doesn't correspond to any documented maintenance entry. 8 days ago. 47 minutes. 47 minutes. Long enough to install the module and test its basic integration. Not so long that it would raise immediate questions on a routine scan. Credentialed access? Ethan asked. That's the part that's complicated. The credential used belongs to a maintenance authorization account. A senior one. Whose account? That's what outside counsel is working on tonight. She hesitated. Vivian asked me to tell you that she's grateful, and that she wants to meet with you in Chicago, when there's more clarity. She said you'd know what she meant. I do, he said. She also said another hesitation. Nora Blake was not a person who hesitated often. She said the Guardian system works. She wanted you to know she understands that now. Ethan stood at the elevator bank on the 4th floor of St. Mary's Hospital at 10:15 in the evening, with a vending machine coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, and he thought about 4 years of building something he'd believed in, and 2 years of watching it be taken apart, and 1 day of watching it do exactly what he'd designed it to do. Tell her I know, he said. He flew back to Chicago the following morning on a commercial flight, coach seat, middle row, which was fine. He slept for most of it. The board hearing was scheduled for 9 days later. In those 9 days, several things happened in the particular sequential way that consequential things tend to happen not all at once, not cleanly, but in a series of developments that each changed the shape of what came next. The FAA's preliminary investigation of the module, combined with Caleb's forensic documentation and Cole's system log, was enough to trigger a formal inquiry. The inquiry moved faster than these things usually did, which told Ethan that the investigators had found something in their own preliminary review that made them treat it as a priority. He didn't know what they'd found. Nobody called to tell him. But the pace was its own communication. Marcus Hale went on what Mercer Aerotech's communications team called indefinite personal leave 5 days after the flight. The announcement used language so carefully neutral that it communicated almost nothing except that someone had decided careful neutrality was the appropriate register, which itself communicated quite a lot. Ethan read it on his phone while waiting to pick up his daughter from school and felt a complicated thing that wasn't satisfaction, exactly more like the particular quality of a problem that has been correctly identified and is now in the process of being addressed, which is different from being solved, but is at least movement in the right direction. Raymond Voss did not go on leave. Raymond Voss retained 2 attorneys and issued a statement through one of them that described the corporate connections Caleb had found as routine investment activity that had been fully disclosed to appropriate parties. Ethan read that statement too and thought about the word disclosed and what it did and didn't mean. Lena was discharged from St. Mary's 6 days after the flight. She called Ethan from the rideshare taking her home, and the tiredness in her voice was the good kind, now the kind that comes from a body that has done the hard part and is ready to rest somewhere familiar. Caleb was called in as a technical witness for the FAA inquiry. He told Ethan about it in a text that said, "Flying to DC Tuesday. Your evidence chain held up. They want me to walk them through the module architecture." Ethan had responded with a single thumbs up, which was inadequate but was what he had. The board hearing was in a conference room on the 23rd floor of Mercer Aerotech's Chicago headquarters, a room Ethan had been in exactly once before, 3 years ago, when he'd been called in to explain why the Guardian Systems implementation timeline was running behind schedule. That meeting had lasted 22 minutes. The board had asked 3 questions, all of which were about cost, none of which were about the safety outcomes the timeline was protecting. He'd left that meeting understanding something about the company he hadn't fully understood before. He arrived at the building at 8:40 in the morning with Caleb beside him and a document package that Nora Blake's outside counsel had helped them organize the module, its forensic documentation, the chain of custody record, the system log from the aircraft, the corporate registration connections, and Caleb's technical analysis of the module's function and program destination. The lobby security guard, a young man who was new since Ethan had last been here, looked at his ID and then at a list and then back at the ID. "Vale," the guard said. "Yes, you're cleared for 23. He handed back the ID with the particular efficiency of someone's been told this visitor is expected and has instructions to make it simple. Elevators are on the right. The conference room had 8 board members present, 3 of them remote on a screen at the far end of the table, and a legal team that occupied half of one side. Nora Blake was there as the company's internal counsel, with the outside firm seated beside her. A representative from the FAA's Aviation Safety Division was present in a purely observational capacity, which in Ethan's reading meant the agency was watching what the company did with its own process before deciding what their own next steps would be. Raymond Voss was not in the room. Marcus Hale was not in the room. What was in the room, in the seat directly across from where Ethan was directed to sit, was Vivian Mercer. She looked like someone who had not been sleeping enough, which was reasonable given the week she'd had. She was in a gray suit, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked at him when he sat down with an expression that was trying to be boardroom neutral and not entirely succeeding, which he understood they'd both been through something unusual together, and the conference room format didn't fully accommodate that. The outside counsel, a woman named Patricia Wren, who had the manner of someone who had spent 30 years being the most prepared person in any room she entered, opened the proceedings by summarizing the chain of events and the evidence gathered, which took 17 minutes and was thorough in the way that made Ethan slightly nervous, because thorough presentations have a way of making everything sound worse than it is and better than it is simultaneously, and he wasn't sure which direction this would land. Then it was Ethan's turn. He'd been told he had 30 minutes. He used 22. He didn't perform. He didn't use the language of grievance or vindication or any of the emotional vocabulary that would have been available to him and would have been in some ways justified. He talked about the Guardian system, what it was designed to do, why he'd added the Sentinel layer, and what the Sentinel layer had found. He walked through the module's location in the aircraft, its function, its programmed destination. He explained the corporate connections in plain terms, acknowledging what the evidence showed clearly and what it suggested but didn't conclusively prove. He said at one point, "I want to be specific about what I'm claiming and what I'm not. Physical evidence, the module, the system log, corporate registration connects the maintenance access event to an authorization chain that leads to the Hale Strategic Account Group and to Meridian Air Logistics, which has Raymond Voss as a director. What I cannot tell you with certainty is the precise decision-making that produced this outcome. What I can tell you is that this aircraft was modified outside of documented maintenance, that the modification was designed to redirect the flight without detection, and that the financial motive for doing so exists and has been documented." One of the board members, an older man named Garrett, who had been on the board for 11 years and who had, Ethan recalled, been in the meeting 3 years ago that had rubber-stamped the first round of Guardian system modifications, said, "Mr. Vale, you were removed from Mercer Aerotech 3 years ago under contested circumstances. How do we weigh that fact against the evidence you're presenting?" Ethan had expected this question. You weigh it by looking at the physical evidence independently of who found it. The module exists whether I found it or someone else did. The system log entry exists. The corporate registration exists. None of those things are products of my interpretation, they're records. If you find I've misread any of them, I want to know. Garrett nodded slowly. Not agreement, but acknowledgement. Then Marcus came in. Not literally, Marcus wasn't in the building, but his prepared statement was read into the record by a member of his legal team, a young man who read with the careful flatness of someone who had been told to convey the words without conveying any attitude about the words. Statement was what Ethan had expected. Ethan Vale was a former employee with a documented grievance. The corporate connections were coincidental and had been disclosed appropriately. The Sentinel layer was an unauthorized system modification that Ethan himself had introduced without company approval, and the entire situation was the result of a disgruntled engineer exploiting a backdoor credential to lock an executive aircraft and then presenting himself as the only solution. It was well constructed. Ethan had to give Marcus that. Each individual element of it had some truth attached, and the arrangement of those truths was designed to produce a picture that wasn't entirely false, but wasn't the picture of what had actually happened. The board was quiet after the statement was read. Then Vivian spoke for the first time since the proceedings had begun. "I want to address one thing in that statement directly," she said. She wasn't looking at the lawyer who'd read it. She was looking at the board. Mr. Vale's backdoor credential. The statement describes it as an unauthorized modification. She paused. "I've had our technical team review the Guardian Systems architecture in the past 9 days. The credential Mr. Vale used, the foundational authentication layer, was part of the original system design. It was documented in the original submission to the board when the Guardian system was approved. It was not hidden. It was in the design specifications that this board approved." She let that sit for a moment. "We chose not to understand it at the time. That's different from Mr. Vale doing something unauthorized." The room was quiet. Ethan looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. One of the remote board members, a woman whose name Ethan hadn't caught, said, "And the Sentinel layer?" "The statement claims that's an unauthorized addition. The Sentinel layer was not in the original approved documentation," Ethan said. "That part of the statement is accurate. I added it during the final development phase without a formal approval process." Why? He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I was concerned that if I submitted it through the formal approval process, it would be modified or removed. The Sentinel layer was specifically designed to detect deliberate modifications to protected systems. If the people reviewing the approval had interests in making modifications to protected systems, I was worried they'd find a reason to change it. Another silence. Longer. "You built a safety system," Garrett said slowly, "with a hidden layer specifically designed to survive attempts by the company to remove it." "Yes," Ethan said. "And you're asking this board to view that as a responsible engineering decision." "I'm asking this board to consider that the hidden layer is the reason this aircraft didn't take off with an unauthorized navigation modification active," Ethan said. It did exactly what I built it to do, in exactly the scenario I built it for. You can decide whether I was right to build it that way. But I don't think the outcome is in dispute. The room stayed quiet for long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Patricia Wren presented the corporate documentation, next the Meridian registration, the law firm connection, the Northbridge shareholding under the Vantage Capital Fund. She presented it methodically, without drama, connecting each point to the next with the precision of someone laying track one piece at a time. When she was done, one of the board members said, "Where is Raymond Voss in all of this?" Nora said, "Mr. Voss's counsel has indicated he is cooperating with the FAA inquiry and has declined to participate in this hearing, pending the outcome of that inquiry." "Declined," the board member repeated. "That's correct." Another silence. Ethan looked at the table in front of him. He thought about what Caleb had said in Redwood City, that the people who did what Marcus did didn't get rid of the people who were wrong. They got rid of the people who made it harder to be wrong without consequences. He thought about standing in this same building 3 years ago, being told that his employment was being terminated due to a strategic restructuring, which was the phrase that meant something true was being said in a way that made it untrue. He hadn't fought it then. He'd been exhausted, and his daughter was 4 years old and needed him home. The fight would have taken years, and he wasn't sure it would have produced anything worth the years it took. He'd walked out with his badge surrendered and his parking pass deactivated, and a cardboard box of personal items from his desk that he still hadn't fully unpacked. He thought about the canvas bag he'd carried onto a jet that didn't want him there, about the Amber Alert in the corner of a cockpit display, about the decision, made in the 4 seconds he stood at the top of the air stairs before walking down them, that he was going to pay attention to what that alert meant, even if no one had asked him to. Lena had asked him once, a year after he left Mercer, whether he regretted building the Guardian system for a company that then pushed him out. He'd thought about it for a while before answering, which was his way, and what he'd said was no. Because the system was real regardless of what the company did with it. The thing he'd built existed independently of the people who'd chosen not to honor what it was. He still believed that. The board took a recess at 11:15. Ethan and Caleb waited in a smaller room down the hall, with coffee that was better than the hospital vending machine coffee, and a view of the Chicago skyline that was doing that thing it did in late morning, where the light came from an angle that made the buildings look sharper than they actually were. Caleb had his laptop open and was corresponding with the FAA technical team about the module's interface specifications. He'd been doing this all morning, in the margins of the hearing, the kind of parallel processing that engineers did when the proceedings around them weren't requiring their active attention. "How do you think it's going?" Caleb asked without looking up. "I don't know," Ethan said. "Boards do what boards do." That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. Caleb typed something. The FAA team found a second point of interest in the module. They called me this morning before the hearing. There's a communication trigger, a wireless signal emitter embedded in the casing. When the navigation diversion was within 30 minutes of initiating, the module would have sent a signal to an external receiver. Ethan looked at him, to notify someone the diversion was in progress. That's what it looks like. They haven't traced the receiver yet. Ethan thought about that. A notification system built into the module meant whoever installed it wanted real-time confirmation that the diversion was happening. That was beyond passive interference, that was active monitoring of a flight in progress. The legal implications of that were considerably more serious than what was already on the table. When are they going to have the receiver traced? They said a few days. They're working backward from the signal frequency. Caleb finally looked up. This is going to get bigger before it gets smaller. "I know," Ethan said. Nora Blake appeared in the doorway at 11:50 and told them the board was ready to reconvene. They went back into the conference room. The board members had rearranged slightly, or maybe it was just that Ethan was reading the room differently now, because several of them were sitting differently. The subtle postural shift of people who have made a decision and are now inhabiting it. Garrett was looking at his notepad. The woman on the remote screen had her hands folded in a way that looked settled rather than waiting. Vivian was looking at Ethan when he sat down. The board chair, a man named Howard Chen, who had said almost nothing during the morning session, and whom Ethan had been watching precisely because of that silence, said, "We're prepared to share preliminary determinations, with the understanding that the FAA inquiry is ongoing and full conclusions will be contingent on that process." He read from a prepared document. Marcus Hale was suspended with immediate effect, pending the outcome of the FAA inquiry and a parallel internal investigation into the maintenance authorization records associated with the MA7 Access event. Raymond Voss was removed from the Strategic Advisory Board pending a full conflict of interest review, which the board acknowledged should have been identified and addressed during the Northbridge acquisition process. The Northbridge acquisition, Ethan learned for the first time in this room, had been completed. Vivian had made the 10 o'clock meeting the morning after the flight, arriving with 40 minutes to spare. The $700 million deal was done. Whatever Raymond and Marcus had been trying to prevent had not been prevented. The board also determined that the modifications made to the Guardian safety architecture between 18 months ago and 1 year ago, the ones that had removed redundancy layers and weakened the system's override protections, were to be reversed. Full engineering review would be commissioned to restore the system to its original specification. And then Howard Chen said something Ethan hadn't expected. The board has also determined that the original authorship and intellectual contribution of the Guardian safety architecture has been insufficiently attributed in the company's records and licensing documentation. We are commissioning a formal review of intellectual property attribution, with the intent of restoring correct authorship and where compensation was not properly rendered for that intellectual property, addressing that gap. Ethan sat very still. He hadn't come here for that. He'd come because a system he'd built had found something dangerous, and he'd followed it to where it led. He hadn't come prepared for the board to say out loud that what was taken from him had been taken. Caleb beside him had gone very still too. Howard Chen set down his document. Mr. Vale, the board would like to express formally, on the record, that your actions in identifying and preserving evidence of the modification to the MA7, at personal inconvenience and without any obligation to do so, reflected a standard of professional responsibility that the company failed to honor during your tenure here. We are not in a position to undo what happened 3 years ago, but we can acknowledge it. The room was quiet. Ethan looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. I appreciate that, he said. It wasn't much. He wasn't going to say more than that, because the thing about moments like this was that adding words to them tended to make them smaller rather than larger, and he wanted to let it be what it was. After the hearing in the elevator going down, Caleb said nothing for 3 floors. Then he said, they said the Guardian system is going back to original spec. Yes, Ethan said. Your spec. Yes. Caleb looked at the elevator doors. Do you feel anything? Ethan thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. It was the specific mixture of things that happens when something you've been carrying a long time is set down, and you feel both the relief of not carrying it and the strange weightlessness of not having it anymore. And neither of those things is entirely comfortable. Yeah, he said. I feel something. The elevator opened on the lobby. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in the late morning wind off the lake. The smell of the city, people moving with the particular purposeful speed of a place that takes its own motion seriously. Ethan stood on the sidewalk with his canvas bag over one shoulder and thought about his daughter, who was in school right now, building a bridge out of popsicle sticks, and didn't know anything about any of this, and about Lena in her apartment in San Francisco, probably watching the house renovation show, and about the MA7 sitting somewhere in Mercer's fleet with a maintenance hold on it and a gap in its electronics bay where the module had been. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't have saved. This is Vivian. I heard what Howard said in there. I want you to know the IP review is not a formality. We're going to do it right. He looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed back, I know. Thank you. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the skyline. There was still the FAA inquiry. Still the question of the wireless receiver Caleb had mentioned, and who it had been transmitting to, and what that would mean for the full scope of what Marcus and Raymond had built. Still the intellectual property review, and whatever that process would surface, and the long, institutional work of restoring something that had been systematically taken apart. None of that was finished. Most of it hadn't really begun. But the board hearing was done, and the Guardian system was going back to what it was supposed to be, and the evidence he'd carried across the country in a canvas bag had landed where it needed to land. He started walking toward the parking structure where Caleb's rental car was, and the wind came in off the lake, the way it always did, cold and direct, and not particularly interested in anyone's feelings about it, and Ethan pulled his jacket tighter and kept walking. The FAA's formal findings came out on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the flight. Ethan was at his kitchen table when the notification came through, not a call, not a dramatic announcement, just an email from the agency's Aviation Safety Division with a case number in the subject line and a 43-page document attached. His daughter Maya was at school. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments are quiet when a child who normally occupies them is somewhere else, a specific absence that has its own texture. He made coffee, sat back down, and read through all 43 pages. The findings were thorough, in the way that federal investigations are thorough. When they've found what they were looking for, methodical, documented, cross-referenced, the kind of document that takes everything that happened and renders it in a language so precise it becomes almost unrecognizable from the inside of having lived it. But the conclusions were clear enough. The module installed in the MA-7 constituted deliberate unauthorized modification of a flight-critical navigation system. The maintenance access event 8 days prior to the flight had been authorized using credentials belonging to a senior maintenance account within Mercer Aerotech's internal systems, an account that, according to the access audit, had not been used by its registered holder in 14 months. The credentials had been accessed externally through a remote login that had been routed through 2 intermediary servers before originating from an IP address registered to a technology services company in Delaware that shared a registered agent with Meridian Air Logistics. The wireless signal emitter embedded in the module, the component Caleb had identified during the secondary analysis, had been traced. The receiver was a device registered to a logistics coordination firm that, through 2 layers of corporate structure, was also connected to the Vantage Capital Strategies Fund. The signal would have confirmed to whoever was monitoring that the navigation diversion was active. Someone had wanted to watch it happen in real time. That detail, more than anything else in the 43 pages, was the one that sat with Ethan after he closed the document. Not the technical specifics, not the corporate architecture, but the image of someone sitting somewhere watching a signal that told them a $60 million aircraft carrying people had been successfully redirected without their knowledge. Casual monstrousness of it. The distance between what that required you to believe about other people, that their safety was a variable, adjustable, subordinate to a financial position, and what Ethan had spent his career believing, which was the opposite of that, entirely. He thought about the first safety protocol he'd ever written, years before the Guardian system, a simple fault detection routine for a regional carrier's avionics package. He'd been 27. His supervisor had looked at it and said it was overbuilt, that he'd included redundancies for scenarios that would never happen. Ethan had said that the point of a redundancy was that you hoped it never happened. His supervisor had shrugged and approved it anyway, because the timeline was tight and arguing took time. He still thought about that exchange sometimes, about how the logic of it will never happen is always being written by people who haven't been present the one time it does. His phone rang. "Caleb, you read it," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "Just finished." "The receiver trace," Caleb said. "I didn't see that coming." "The emitter, yes, once I found it, I knew what it was for. But tracing it back that far, they had resources we didn't." "Yeah." A pause. "Marcus is going to have a very bad several months." "Longer than months," Ethan said. "Deliberate modification of a flight-critical system is a federal matter. The wireless monitoring component makes it worse. His attorneys are going to earn whatever he's paying them. And Raymond." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Raymond Voss was a more complicated thing to think about, not because what he'd done was ambiguous. The corporate connections were now part of a federal record, but because Raymond was 67 years old and had been part of Mercer Aerotech since before Vivian was running it, and the scale of what he'd been willing to do in pursuit of a financial position was the kind of thing that made you recalibrate your read of a person entirely. You didn't just get surprised by that. You sat with it. "Raymond is cooperating," Ethan said. "From what Nora told me last week, he's been providing information about the structure of the arrangement in exchange for the inquiry team recommending leniency on certain counts." "Cooperating," Caleb said, with the specific tone of someone who finds the word inadequate. "It means some things get answered that might not have gotten answered otherwise," Ethan said. "I'll take the answers." He would. He wasn't at peace with what Raymond had done. He wasn't sure peace was the right framework, but the information Raymond was providing was filling in the gaps that the physical evidence alone couldn't close. Who had commissioned the module's construction? Who had arranged the maintenance window? The full sequence of decisions that had turned a financial competition into something that put people in an aircraft with compromised navigation. That sequence mattered, not for Ethan's sake, but because if you didn't understand the full sequence, you couldn't build anything that prevented the next one. That was the engineering of it. And Ethan, for better or worse, thought about most things as engineering. He spent the afternoon at Maya's school, where he'd volunteered to help with the bridge building project because her teacher had put out a request for anyone with structural knowledge, and Maya had mentioned it at breakfast with the careful casualness of someone who wanted him to volunteer but didn't want to ask directly. He spent 2 hours at a table with 7 8-year-olds and a significant quantity of popsicle sticks, and the conversation was almost entirely about whether the bridge needed to be pretty as well as functional, which the children were divided on, and which Ethan thought was actually a reasonable engineering debate. Does it matter if it's pretty? A boy named Davis asked, directing the question at Ethan with the solemnity of someone who wanted an adult opinion. Depends on what it's for, Ethan said. If it just has to hold weight, pretty is optional. People have to want to use it, then how it looks is part of how it works. Davis considered this with great seriousness. Maya, next to him, was fitting 2 sticks together with the focused precision of someone who had grown up around a person who talked about structural integrity at dinner. "Dad," she said without looking up, "is the angle right on this joint?" He leaned over. "Move the vertical piece 3 millimeters to the left." She moved it. Better. He drove her home afterward, and she talked the entire way about the bridge, and about a girl in her class named Priya, who had a dog that could open doors, and about a chapter book she was reading that she described as scary but good. And Ethan listened to all of it with the particular quality of attention that he reserved for her, not the engineering attention, not the problem-solving attention, but the simpler and harder kind, which was just being present with another person without trying to fix anything. His ex-wife, Caroline, had once told him that his greatest professional strength and his most significant personal limitation were the same thing, that he approached everything as a problem with a solution, and that some things, including the way people felt about each other, were not that. He'd disagreed with her at the time, not because she was wrong, but because he didn't know how to agree with something that felt like a verdict. 3 years later, alone in an apartment that still had her handwriting on a label inside one of the kitchen cabinet doors, he understood it better. Not that he'd fixed it, but he understood it. Maya, mercifully, was not a problem to be solved. She was just herself, direct, specific, occasionally exasperating in the way of a child who has inherited the tendency to think carefully before speaking and has not yet learned to use it sparingly in social situations. She was fine. She was, in the specific accounting that mattered to him, the thing he'd gotten most right, which he recognized was partly luck and partly Caroline and only partly him. He made dinner, she did her homework at the kitchen table, and at 8:15 she went to bed without being asked twice, which was either a sign that the day had tired her out or that she was coming down with something, and he checked her forehead out of habit, and she batted his hand away with the dignity of someone who is 8 and therefore does not need her forehead checked. After she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the FAA document pulled back up on his laptop and worked through the technical appendices, which were the part of the report that contained the actual engineering analysis of the module. The team that had written it knew their work. They'd identified 3 design elements in the module's construction that Ethan hadn't caught in his initial read, refinements in the navigation spoofing protocol that were sophisticated enough to tell him that whoever had built the module wasn't a general contractor. They'd built specifically for the Guardian architecture. They'd known it from the inside. That knowledge had been sitting in the back of his mind for 6 weeks. The module's constructor had intimate familiarity with his system. Not documentation-level familiarity, the kind that comes from having worked on it. The list of people with that level of knowledge was the same list he'd thought about on the aircraft: small, specific, mostly people he'd worked with directly. He went to bed at midnight and didn't sleep well, which had become his baseline since the flight, and which he had decided to tolerate rather than treat, because the thing keeping him awake wasn't anxiety exactly, more the persistent awareness of an open thread. The intellectual property review took 11 weeks. Ethan had expected it to take longer, or to find reasons to become smaller than it needed to be, because institutional processes of that kind tended to compress under the pressure of what they cost. But Patricia Wren's outside firm ran it with the same methodical attention she'd brought to the board hearing. And what they found was documented in a report that Ethan read in Nora Blake's office on a gray November afternoon, with rain coming off Lake Michigan sideways against the windows. The Guardian safety architecture had been filed under a Mercer Aerotech corporate patent, with the authorship attributed to a development team, which was the standard corporate structure and which was not itself unusual. What was unusual and what the review had surfaced was that the original design submissions, the foundational architecture documents, and the core patent claims had all been developed by Ethan as the singular author, working before the formal team had been assembled, and that the corporate filing had absorbed that individual authorship in a way that was legally permissible under his employment contract, but that had also, in the review's language, not reflected accurate attribution in subsequent licensing, commercial application, or internal documentation, which meant, in the language that people use when they don't want to say a thing directly, that the company had taken credit it hadn't earned and denied credit to the person it belonged to. The review recommended 3 things. First, that Ethan's authorship be formally restored in all Guardian system documentation and licensing materials. Second, that the compensation structure for the system's commercial licensing, which had generated significant revenue over the past several years, be reviewed against what his original employment contract had specified for intellectual property contribution, and that the gap between what he'd received and what the contract specified be addressed. Third, that a formal protection protocol be established for engineers reporting safety-critical modifications, with clear procedures and independence from corporate pressure. Nora had a summary sheet on the table when he came in. She slid it across without preamble. He read it, looked up. Compensation gap, he said. How are they calculating it? Percentage of commercial licensing revenue over the deployment period, adjusted for the contract's IP contribution clause. She folded her hands. It's a meaningful number. He didn't ask what the number was yet. He sat with the summary for a moment. 11 weeks of a process that was, at its core, a company looking at what it had done and saying, this was wrong. Not in the comfortable language of mistakes we're made, but specifically, you built this. We took the credit. We owe you the difference. He'd spent 3 years not expecting that. He'd genuinely, concretely not expected it. He'd made his peace, or what he'd called his peace, which was probably more accurately described as a managed tolerance, with the idea that the system existed, that it worked, that somewhere it was doing what he'd built it to do, and that would have to be enough. It turned out it wasn't the only thing. The number, he said. Nora told him. He was quiet for a moment. That's accurate? He said. Patricia's team verified it 3 times. The licensing revenue figures are from audited financials. He looked out the window at the rain. He thought about 3 years of school pickups in a car with a heating system that worked inconsistently. He thought about the medical bill from Maya's broken arm that had taken 8 months to clear. He thought about small calculations, the restaurant he'd skipped, the trip he'd deferred, the list of things that had been put aside because the money wasn't there for them. He wasn't going to cry about it. He was 41 years old, and he was in a law office, and he didn't cry in professional settings. And also, the number on the table didn't make him sad. It made him feel something more complicated. The mixture of relief and retroactive exhaustion that comes from understanding how much you'd been carrying, that you didn't have to carry if things had gone differently. Tell them I accept the review's recommendations, he said. All 3. All 3. Nora made a note. The 3rd recommendation, the protection protocol for engineers. Vivian wants your input on how it's structured. Tell her I'll send thoughts, he said. He meant it. That one mattered to him more than the others, in a way that wasn't about him at all, which was the whole point. He left Nora's office and walked out into the rain without a fully adequate jacket, because the weather had shifted faster than he'd expected when he left the apartment that morning, and he stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment getting lightly rained on, while he decided which direction to walk. He called Lena. She answered immediately, which meant she'd been waiting to hear how the meeting went, which she would deny if he mentioned it. Done, he said. And they're restoring authorship. The IP review came back the way Patricia said it would. The compensation number is its real. A pause. Ethan. I know. She stopped. He could hear her doing the same thing he'd done in Nora's office, the same recalibration, the same retroactive arithmetic of 3 years. Are you okay? Yeah, he said. I'm standing in the rain outside a law office. which is probably not the dignified way to process this, but otherwise, yes. She laughed, the real laugh, not the performed one. Go inside somewhere. In a minute. Ethan, go inside. Lena. He said it the way she said his name, with the weight of someone who has known the other person long enough to hear what they're not saying. I'm okay. I just needed a minute. She was quiet. Okay, she said. The good kind of okay. He found a coffee shop half a block down and sat at a table near the window and watched the rain for a while and drank something that was either a latte or a cappuccino. He hadn't paid full attention when he ordered and thought about the protection protocol. The third recommendation was the one that would matter longest. The money would settle the arithmetic of 3 years, and the authorship restoration would correct a record, and both of those things were right and necessary. But the protocol, the structural protection for engineers who found something wrong and reported it, that was the thing that affected people who hadn't been in any of these rooms, who would never know Ethan Vale's name, who would find themselves at some future point standing at the top of an air stairs with information they didn't know what to do with. He'd been lucky, in a specific and uncomfortable way. He'd had the backdoor credential. He'd had 11 years of institutional knowledge. He'd had Caleb and the diagnostic rig, and Captain Cole and the particular stubbornness that his sister called his worst quality and his best one, depending on the day. Most engineers who found something wrong didn't have any of that. Most of them had a choice between speaking up through channels that weren't built to protect them and staying quiet in ways that felt safer but weren't. He knew which choice most of them made, because he'd made it himself once, early in his career at Mercer, before the Guardian system, before any of this. He'd found a discrepancy in a maintenance record and had raised it informally and been told, by someone senior enough to make the conversation feel conclusive, that it was within acceptable parameters and that his instinct to escalate was noted. He hadn't escalated. The discrepancy had turned out to be genuinely minor. But the memory of the choice of the calculation he'd made, weighing the risk to his position against the risk of being wrong about a safety concern, had stayed with him. It was part of why the Sentinel layer existed. He'd built the thing that would catch what he himself might have been too cautious to report. He drafted a note on his phone about the protocol structure, rough points, things he wanted the framework to include, anonymity options in the initial reporting phase, an independent technical review channel that sat outside the normal corporate hierarchy, a formal timeline for response that couldn't be administratively buried, protection from professional retaliation that had actual teeth, not the performative kind. He sent it to Nora's email with a subject line that said some starting points and put his phone down. The rain was easing. The street outside was the wet pavement gray of November in Chicago, and the people moving along it had the particular forward lean of people who have accepted the weather as a condition rather than a complaint. He liked this city in spite of its weather, had lived here long enough that the cold felt like a known quantity rather than an imposition. Maya had been born here. He expected she'd leave someday, most people with options did, but she'd come back to it later, probably. The way people come back to places that shaped them, even when they didn't know they were being shaped. He thought about the terminal where this had started. The glass and steel and deliberate silence, the checkpoint he'd gotten through on an expired badge and a security guard's recognition. The aircraft sitting on the tarmac with the fuel intake cap that had first caught his eye. All the small things that had to align in a particular sequence for the day to go the way it went. He wasn't a believer in fate. He was an engineer. He believed in systems in the way that structures built carefully and honestly tend to produce the outcomes they were designed for. He believed that if you built something with integrity, and you built it to survive the attempts of people who didn't share that integrity, it would sometimes, not always but sometimes, outlast the people trying to compromise it. The Guardian system had outlasted 3 years of being modified and reduced and quietly stripped of what made it what it was. And on a specific afternoon on a Chicago tarmac, when someone had put a device in an aircraft and pointed it somewhere no one had agreed to go, part of the system that had never been documented and never been approved and had lived entirely on the faith that it would matter if it was ever needed, that part had done what it was built to do. Ethan picked up his coffee and finished it and thought, that's the whole thing, really. You build it as honestly as you can and you hope it's there when it needs to be. That's the whole thing. He went back to his apartment, changed into dry clothes, and spent the afternoon on the protocol document, which grew from rough notes into something more structured over the course of 3 hours. At 5, he stopped and called Caleb. "FA report," Caleb said when he answered. "And the IP review." "How did you know?" "Because it's been 11 weeks, and you would have called if it went badly. The fact that you're calling now means it went the way it was supposed to go." "More or less," Ethan said. "The receiver trace, did the agency give you the final confirmation on the corporate chain?" "Yesterday. It's in the supplemental findings. All the way back to Vantage Capital." A pause. Raymond's cooperation filled in the last gap. The module was commissioned through a technical contractor, a small avionics firm in Nevada that Marcus had a consulting relationship with. Raymond provided the funding structure through the Delaware Holding Company. Marcus handled the operational side. The contractor, Ethan said. They'd worked on Guardian before. One of their engineers had. 3 years ago, short-term contract, never renewed. Caleb paused. "He's been identified. He's cooperating too." There it was. The open thread. The person who'd known the system from the inside well enough to build something that could sit inside it undetected until the part of it that wasn't in any documentation had found it anyway. "The contractor is facing federal charges," Caleb said, along with Marcus. "Raymond's cooperation means his exposure is different, but his attorneys are not having a good fall." Ethan thought about all of them. Marcus, who had spent 20 years building a career out of knowing how to make the wrong thing sound like the right decision. Raymond, who had been patient in ways that turned out to be a specific kind of patient, the kind that waits for the right arrangement of vulnerability and opportunity, and then acts without considering what it costs the people in the aircraft. Contractor's engineer, who had built a thing knowing what it was for and had decided that was someone else's problem. He didn't have clean feelings about any of them. He had complicated ones, which was probably more accurate anyway. The people who do harmful things are rarely the simplified villains that the stories we tell about them need them to be. Marcus was also the person who had, in that tense conversation in row 3 of the aircraft, said, "I hope you're not wrong," and Ethan had never fully decided what was in that sentence. Raymond had worked 19 years for a company his judgment had eventually betrayed. People were the full, complicated thing they were, and nothing that had happened changed that in a way that made it simpler. What it changed was the record, and sometimes the record was the thing that mattered. The formal ceremony, which was too grand a word for what it actually was, but no smaller word quite fit, happened on a Tuesday in December, a month after the IP review was finalized. Vivian had called it a meeting. Nora had called it a signing. Caleb, who attended because Ethan had asked him to, called it whatever you want to call it. "I'm coming." It was in the same conference room on the 23rd floor. The same view of the Chicago skyline, which in December had the low flat light that made buildings look like they were slightly further away than they were. Howard Chen was there, and 3 other board members, and Patricia Wren, and Nora, and a systems engineer named Lena Dawson, who had been hired 3 months ago specifically to oversee the Guardian system restoration, and who had apparently read everything Ethan had ever written about the architecture and had questions that were excellent in the specific way of someone who hadn't just read the documentation, but had understood it. Lena Dawson was not Ethan's sister. The name had startled him briefly when Vivian mentioned her. But she was 31 and from Portland and had a directness that reminded him of his own sister, only in the sense that both women treated technical conversation as a collaborative exercise rather than a performance. She had shaken his hand at the door of the conference room and said, "I found the section on the Sentinel layer in the original design notes. The notes you didn't put in the formal documentation. How did you know where to hide them?" "I didn't hide them," he said. "I just didn't submit them anywhere obvious." "Same thing." "Functionally, maybe," he said. She'd grinned. "I have 18 pages of questions. Send them to my email after this." The documents were straightforward in the way that formal documents are dense with language that covered every possible angle of what was being agreed to, which was necessary and also, in Ethan's reading, slightly absurd, because you could summarize the whole thing in 2 sentences. The Guardian safety architecture was created by Ethan Vale. He is being credited and compensated accordingly. He signed where he was directed to sign. Caleb witnessed. Vivian signed on behalf of the company with the pen she'd apparently brought from her office, because she had a habit of using the same pen for significant things, which she'd mentioned without irony, and which Ethan had found, unexpectedly, humanizing. After the signing, when the legal team was gathering their copies, and the room was in the small motion of people finishing something, Vivian came to stand beside him at the window. I want to ask you something, she said. You don't have to answer. Okay, when you were walking down the air stairs, before you saw the alert, were you angry? He thought about it. The honest answer required going back to that moment in a specific way, past the engineering of it, past the sequence of decisions, to the actual texture of standing at the top of the stairs with a canvas bag and having just been publicly dismissed by a woman who had looked at his jacket and made a complete judgment. Yes, he said. I was angry. She nodded. She was looking out the window. And then you came back anyway. The alert changed the calculation, he said. But if there hadn't been an alert, if you just walked down and the aircraft had taxied away and nothing had happened, she turned to look at him. Would you have stayed angry? He thought about that longer. Probably, he said, for a while. And then I'd have let it go, because staying angry at something that's already finished costs more than it returns. He paused. But I also wouldn't have forgotten it. There's a difference. She was quiet. I don't make decisions the way I made that one, she said. And it wasn't defensive, it was the specific quality of a person trying to be accurate. The way I looked at you and decided I knew what I was looking at. I don't think I do that regularly, but I did it that day, and I'd like to understand why. Power does something to pattern recognition, Ethan said. When you're used to being right about the decisions that matter, you start assuming you're right about the ones that don't, the ones that feel small. He looked at the skyline. Judging someone by their shoes is a small decision. It doesn't feel like it costs anything, until it costs everything. She absorbed that without answering, which was its own kind of answer. The protection protocol, she said after a moment. The framework you sent Nora. We're implementing it. Full structure, all 4 elements, independent oversight. She paused. I want you to be involved in the implementation if you're willing. As a consultant, as the person who knows what it needs to do. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to come back to the company. I'm not asking that. But the protocol needs to work. And it needs to work for people who are in the position you were in when you found that alert. I want it built by someone who knows what that position actually feels like. He thought about the engineer at the avionics firm in Nevada who had built the module. Had that person been in a version of the same position found something, or been asked to build something, and made the calculation that silence or compliance was safer than speaking? He didn't know. He'd probably never know. But the protocol was partly for people who hadn't yet reached that fork, who were still early enough in the sequence to go a different way, if they had a path to go a different way. I'll be involved, he said. The day after the signing, Ethan drove Maya to school in the morning with the heater working, which it had been consistently since he'd had it fixed 2 weeks earlier, a small repair. Straightforward. The kind he'd been putting off without quite acknowledging that he was putting it off. Maya sat in the passenger seat with her bridge project in her lap, which she was bringing in for a second structural evaluation, because the first one had identified a weakness in the primary load-bearing joint, and she wanted it assessed before the class presentation. Is the repair holding, she asked. Not about the car, about the bridge. The repair is holding, he said. The load distribution is better than the original joint. Davis says it doesn't matter because it's not going to be tested with real weight. What do you think? She considered it the way she considered things. I think it should be able to hold real weight, even if it's not going to. Because if it can't, the design is wrong. He looked at her for a moment. She was looking at the bridge, turning it slightly in her hands, checking the joint with the focused attention of someone who trusted what they'd built, but wanted to verify anyway. That's right, he said. She shrugged, the shrug of someone who had thought it through and arrived at the obvious conclusion and didn't think it required celebration. I know, she said. He dropped her at school and watched her walk in through the main entrance, bridge under her arm, with the particular posture of a child who knows where she's going and isn't worried about arriving. 3 months later, on a morning that was finally starting to feel like spring the cold, still there but no longer the main event, the light coming back at a different angle, Ethan returned to the private executive terminal at Mercer Aerotech's Chicago facility. He wasn't carrying a canvas bag this time. He had a proper carry-on, navy blue, the one Maya had picked out with the stipulation that it had wheels because she found his previous bag structurally inadequate and had said so with the bluntness of someone who had not yet learned to soften engineering assessments. He went through the first checkpoint with a badge that was current because Mercer had issued him a consulting credential as part of the IP agreement, a physical card with his name on it, and an expiration date 14 months in the future. The second checkpoint was staffed by the same security guard who had waved him through 3 years ago on an expired badge. The man looked at the current badge, looked at Ethan, and gave the same nod he'd given that afternoon, the unceremonious acknowledgement of someone who'd made a judgment call and was comfortable with how it had turned out. Tarmac was familiar. The MA7 was at the same gate. It looked the same from the outside, same white fuselage, same Mercer Aerotech livery, same geometry that Ethan had looked at through a terminal window on an afternoon that felt further away than it was. It had been in maintenance for 2 months after the flight, undergoing the Guardian system restoration and a full systems audit. Lena Dawson had overseen the technical side of the restoration, and she'd sent Ethan the completion report with a note that said, "It's back to what you built. All of it, including the part you didn't put in the formal documentation." He'd read that sentence 3 times. Vivian was at the foot of the air stairs. She was in a different suit than the one she'd worn that first day, darker, and she was not holding herself with the same rigid authority she'd had then, the particular posture of someone who is certain they're right before they've checked. She looked like someone who had been through a difficult several months and had come out of it knowing things she hadn't known before, which was not the same as looking defeated. It was the different thing, the less comfortable but more honest thing. "Mr. Vale," she said. "Miss Mercer." She almost smiled. "Ethan, Vivian," she looked at his carry-on, no canvas bag. "My daughter replaced it. She found it structurally inadequate." This time she did smile briefly, the real kind. "Smart kid. She has opinions," he said. Captain Cole appeared at the top of the air stairs. He looked down at Ethan with the steady expression of a man who had flown a lot of difficult hours and had a particular appreciation for the ones that resolved correctly. "Mr. Vale," he said, "Captain Aircraft is ready." He paused. "She's running the full Guardian protocol. I watched the pre-flight sequence myself." "Good," Ethan said. He climbed the air stairs. The cabin was the same cream leather and recessed lighting, the same narrow luxury corridor. Different passengers, this time 2 members of the legal team, Lena Dawson with a laptop already open, a communications consultant whose name Ethan didn't know. None of them were Marcus. None of them were Raymond. Ethan took a seat. Not row 3, this time row 2, which was where Vivian indicated when she followed him up. He put his carry-on in the overhead and sat down and looked out the window at the tarmac. At the same flat angle of morning light he remembered from that afternoon in September, though different now, the quality of spring rather than late summer. Vivian sat across the aisle. She had a folder open and was looking at something, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, which was fine. There was a companionable quality to the silence now that hadn't been possible the first time, the kind that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to perform around each other anymore. Then she said, without looking up from the folder, "When we land in San Francisco, I'd like you to come to the Northbridge meeting." He looked at her. "As what?" "As the person who made sure we got there." She looked up. "The Guardian system is part of the Northbridge integration. They want to understand it. I'd like them to hear about it from the person who built it." He thought about that, about sitting in a room and talking about the system as something that belonged to him, fully and on the record, without the careful corporate language that had absorbed it and made it into a team product and a company asset. Talking about it as, "I built this. Here's what it does. Here's why it does it that way." "All right," he said. Cabin door sealed. The engines began their sequence, the low build of sound that he'd been listening to for 20 years, and that still had the same quality it always had. Not comfortable exactly, but right. The sound of a system doing what it was designed to do. Cole's voice came over the intercom. "Cabin crew, prepare for departure. We're cleared for the runway." Ethan looked out the window as the aircraft began to move. The tarmac passed slowly at first, then with gathering purpose, the way things move when they've been building toward motion for a long time. At the end of the taxi route, the aircraft turned toward the runway, and he could see through the cockpit door left slightly open, the way Cole sometimes left it, the primary display screen. At the bottom of the screen, in small green text, "Manual authority ready, Guardian safety architecture active." He looked at it for a moment. The words were ordinary in their way, a system status indicator. A line of text in a standard display font, the kind of thing you would see and not think about if you didn't know what it had taken to get it there. If you didn't know that it had almost been something different. If you didn't know that its presence on that screen meant that a pilot's judgment could not be overridden That automation served the human at the controls rather than substituting for them. That somewhere in the architecture beneath those words was a layer that no one had approved and no one had documented, and that had done the thing it was built for on a September afternoon when someone needed it to. The aircraft reached the runway threshold and stopped for a moment, the breath before the run, the held stillness of something that has all the energy it needs and is simply waiting for the right moment to use it. Then clearance came through. The engine spooled up. The aircraft began its roll, and the terminal building moved past the window, and the ground fell away, and Chicago opened up below the grid of streets, the gray-green of the lake, particular smallness of things that only becomes visible when you're far enough above them to see the whole shape at once. Ethan had spent 20 years around aircraft, had built systems to keep them safe, had watched them take off from terminals and runways and private airstrips in the specific detached way of someone who understood the engineering, but never quite lost the awareness of what it meant that inside this tube of metal and composite and careful design, people were trusting that the thing holding them up was exactly what it claimed to be. That trust was not nothing. It was not a small thing that could be adjusted for commercial reasons or redirected for financial gain without consequence. It was the whole weight of every person who had ever sat in a seat and looked out a window as the ground disappeared and decided, without having a choice, to believe that the people who built this and the people who maintained it and the people who flew it had done their jobs with honesty. He had done his job with honesty. That was the thing he'd been sure of, even when everything else was uncertain, that the system he'd built was built the right way, for the right reasons, to protect the right thing. And that certainty had not always been enough to protect him from the consequences of other people's choices. But it had been enough to build something real, something that lasted, something that, when it was finally needed in the specific way it was designed for, did not fail. There is a thing that happens to people who do good work in places that don't honor it, a slow erosion, not of the work itself, but of the person's relationship to the work. You start to doubt the value of the thing you made, not because it has changed, but because the people around you have stopped treating it as valuable. That erosion is patient and quiet and does not announce itself, and if you're not careful, it replaces what you knew was true with a provisional version of it, hedged and uncertain and diminished. Ethan had felt that erosion. He'd felt it in the years after Mercer, in the careful way he'd stopped talking about the Guardian system in professional settings, in the small adjustments he'd made to how he described his own work, the subtle devaluations that accumulate until a person is presenting a compressed version of themselves without knowing exactly when they started doing it. He hadn't recovered from that all at once. Hadn't recovered from it in the board hearing or the IP review or the moment Nora told him the compensation figure. He'd recovered from it in pieces over months, in small moments that didn't announce themselves as significant. The conversation with Maya about the bridge joint. Lena Dawson's 18 pages of questions. Caleb saying your evidence chain held up in a text from Washington that Ethan had read twice and then put his phone in his pocket because that was enough. The aircraft leveled at cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign went off, and the cabin settled into the particular quality of a flight in progress, the white noise of altitude, the small movements of people adjusting, Lena Dawson's fingers on her keyboard, the faint sound of Vivian turning a page. He thought about his daughter, who was in school right now, probably in the middle of the bridge presentation, explaining to her class, with the directness of someone who had thought it through, that the bridge needed to be able to hold real weight, even if it wasn't going to be tested with real weight, because if it couldn't, the design was wrong. He thought about the canal that runs along the bottom of every decision you make about your work, the question of who you're building it for, and what you're willing to hold on to when the people around you have decided it's not worth holding, and whether the thing you made still means what you meant it to mean when you made it. He thought, yes, it does. That's the whole answer. Outside the window, the cloud layer was below them, and the sky above was the specific blue of altitude, clean and without edges, and the aircraft moved through it with the steadiness of something that knows exactly where it's going. The man they had once judged by his jacket was in row 2, and the system he had built was in the aircraft around him. And somewhere in the architecture below the displays and the interfaces and the carefully documented specifications, the sentinel layer was running quiet, unannounced, exactly as it had always been, watching for the thing that shouldn't be there and waiting, patiently, to be needed.